The story of the Argonauts begins not with heroes or ships, but with a desperate mother's love and a divine intervention that would echo through generations. In the mountainous region of Boeotia, where the morning mists clung to ancient peaks and shepherds guided their flocks through valleys carved by forgotten floods, King Athamas ruled from his fortress city of Orchomenus. His first wife Nephele was no mortal woman but a cloud nymph whose ethereal beauty had captured the king's heart during his youth. She bore him 2 children, Phrixus, a boy with his father's strong jaw and his mother's otherworldly grace, and Hele, a daughter whose laughter rang like silver bells across the palace courtyards. The marriage between mortal and divine rarely endures, and Athamas's wandering eye eventually settled upon Ino, daughter of Cadmus and sister to the tragic Semele. Ino possessed the dark allure of Theban nobility, with calculating intelligence hidden behind doe-like eyes and a smile that promised secrets. When Athamas divorced Nephele to marry this mortal princess, the cloud nymph retreated to her celestial realm, but her maternal instincts remained razor-sharp and focused on the children she had left behind. Ino's hatred for her stepchildren festered like an infected wound. She understood that as long as Phrixus lived, her own sons would never inherit Athamas's throne. The boy, now approaching manhood with broad shoulders and the confident bearing of a future king, represented everything that stood between her offspring and power. Helle, though younger, carried the same divine blood that marked her as a threat to Ino's ambitions. The stepmother's malice required a plan both subtle and devastating, one that would eliminate the children while appearing to be the work of fate rather than human treachery. The opportunity came during a year when the harvest had been particularly bountiful. Ino secretly gathered the seed grain intended for the following year's planting and ordered her servants to parch it over hidden fires in the palace's lower chambers. The grain, once heated beyond viability, looked identical to healthy seed but would never sprout. She then arranged for this dead grain to be distributed to the farmers throughout Athamas's kingdom, ensuring that when spring came, the fields would remain barren despite the farmers' best efforts. As the growing season progressed, and not a single green shoot emerged from the carefully tended soil, panic gripped the kingdom. The people, facing the spectre of famine, demanded answers from their king. Athamas, genuinely bewildered by the agricultural catastrophe, dispatched envoys to the oracle at Delphi, seeking divine guidance. But Ino had anticipated this move as well. She corrupted the returning messengers with gold and threats, convincing them to deliver a fabricated prophecy. The gods demanded the sacrifice of Phrixus to restore fertility to the land. The false oracle struck Athamas like a thunderbolt. The king, torn between his duty to his people and his love for his son, found himself trapped in an impossible situation. The assembled nobles and priests, their faces gaunt with worry about the impending famine, pressed him to obey the divine command. Popular sentiment, carefully manipulated by Ino's agents, began to turn against the royal family, with whispers that the gods were punishing them for some unnamed transgression. High above in her realm among the clouds, Nephele watched these events unfold with growing fury. Her divine perception allowed her to see through Ino's deception clearly, recognizing the stepmother's hand behind every calculated move. The cloud nymph's rage manifested as sudden storms that lashed the kingdom, but mortal affairs required more direct intervention than mere weather. She turned to Zeus himself, pleading for aid in protecting her innocent children from Ino's murderous scheme. The king of the gods, moved by Nephele's anguish and outraged by Ino's manipulation of divine will, acted swiftly. He commanded Hermes to retrieve a magnificent ram from the celestial flocks, a creature unlike any that grazed earthly pastures. This ram possessed a fleece of pure gold that shimmered with its own inner light, each strand containing the essence of divine fire. Its eyes held the wisdom of the immortals, and its hooves could carry it through air as easily as across solid ground. The beast's very presence radiated an aura of sacred power that marked it as a gift from Olympus itself. On the morning appointed for Phrixus's sacrifice, as the boy was led toward the altar, where priests waited with ceremonial knives, the golden ram descended from the heavens like a falling star. Its arrival sent the assembled crowd scrambling for cover, their eyes dazzled by the creature's supernatural radiance. The ram's voice, when it spoke to the children, resonated with the authority of Zeus himself, commanding them to climb upon its back without fear. Phrixus, though startled by the divine intervention, quickly grasped his sister's hand and helped her mount the ram's golden back. Hela, younger and more frightened, clung tightly to her brother as the miraculous beast launched itself skyward. Below them, the crowd watched in stunned silence as the children soared above the palace walls and disappeared into the eastern sky, leaving behind a kingdom that would soon discover its harvest failure had been artificially engineered. The ram's flight carried them far from Boeotia, over lands that stretched like a vast tapestry beneath their feet. They passed above the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, where white-capped waves rolled endlessly towards distant shores. The creature's pace never faltered, its divine nature allowing it to traverse vast distances without rest. But as they flew over the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia, tragedy struck with sudden finality. Hela, overwhelmed by the height and the rushing wind, lost her grip on the ram's golden fleece. Her brother's desperate lunge to catch her came too late, and she plummeted toward the churning waters below. The strait would forever after bear her name, the Hellespont, marking the spot where divine rescue turned to mortal loss. Phrixus, grief-stricken but unable to alter his sister's fate, could only watch as the ram continued its eastward flight toward the distant land of Colchis. King Aeetes ruled Colchis from his palace in the city that would later be known as Phasis, built where the river of the same name emptied into the eastern shores of the Black Sea. The king traced his lineage directly to Helios, the sun god, and this divine heritage showed in his bronze skin that seemed to glow with inner fire and eyes that blazed like molten gold. His realm stretched from the Caucasus Mountains in the north to the Anatolian highlands in the south, encompassing lands rich in gold, timber, and the mysterious arts of sorcery. Aeetes possessed knowledge of magic that rivaled even the gods themselves. His palace chambers contained libraries filled with scrolls describing rituals that could command the elements, summon spirits, and bend the natural world to his will. His daughter Medea had inherited this mystical aptitude, though her powers would not fully manifest until she reached womanhood. The king's mastery of supernatural forces made him a ruler both feared and respected throughout the known world. When the golden ram descended into Aeetes' kingdom, bearing the exhausted and grief-stricken Phrixus, the king immediately recognized the divine nature of both the creature and the circumstances of the boy's arrival. Phrixus, still mourning his sister's death, explained his escape from Ino's treachery and the ram's miraculous rescue. Aeetes, impressed by the youth's noble bearing and moved by his tragic tale, welcomed him into the royal household with full honours. The ram, its divine mission completed, spoke once more to Phrixus with words that carried the weight of destiny. It instructed the young man to sacrifice it to Zeus in gratitude for their escape from Ino's plot, explaining that its death would transform it into an eternal constellation, while its fleece would remain as a testament to divine intervention in mortal affairs. The creature's calm acceptance of its fate reflected the cosmic order that governed all divine actions, where individual sacrifice served greater purposes beyond mortal understanding. Phrixus, though reluctant to kill the beast that had saved his life, understood the necessity of obeying divine will. He constructed an altar of white marble in a grove sacred to Zeus, gathering aromatic woods that would carry the sacrifice's smoke directly to Olympus. The ram submitted willingly to the ritual knife, its golden blood flowing onto the altar stones, while its spirit ascended to join the eternal stars. As promised, the constellation Aries appeared in the heavens that very night, marking the ram's transformation from earthly creature to celestial guardian. The fleece that remained defied every natural law. Rather than decaying like ordinary animal hide, it retained its supernatural properties, continuing to shimmer with divine light that never dimmed. Each golden strand seemed to contain liquid fire, warm to the touch but never burning. The fleece's weight felt substantial, yet somehow ethereal, as if it existed simultaneously in the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Its very presence blessed whatever location contained it, causing crops to flourish, livestock to multiply, and the land itself to prosper beyond natural limits. Aeetes, recognizing the fleece's extraordinary value, claimed it as a treasure of his kingdom. He understood that possessing such a divine artifact elevated his status among earthly rulers while providing tangible proof of the god's favour towards his realm. The king ordered the construction of a sacred grove dedicated to Ares, the god of war, where the fleece would be displayed in a manner befitting its divine origins. The grove of Ares occupied a circular clearing deep within the royal forest, surrounded by ancient oak trees, whose massive trunks required 20 men holding hands to encircle them. At the centre stood a single tree of unprecedented size, its branches reaching toward the heavens like supplicating arms. This primordial oak, older than human memory, had witnessed the birth of kingdoms and the fall of dynasties. Its bark bore the scars of countless storms and seasons, while its roots delved so deep into the earth that they seemed to touch the very foundations of the world. Aeetes commanded his finest craftsmen to create a display worthy of the golden fleece's supernatural nature. They fashioned hooks of consecrated bronze, blessed by priests of Ares and inscribed with protective runes that would guard against theft or desecration. The fleece was hung from the great oak's central branch, positioned so that it caught the first rays of dawn and the last light of evening, creating a beacon visible from great distances across the kingdom. The grove's sanctity was protected by more than human guardianship. Aeetes employed his mastery of sorcery to summon guardians that would deter any who might covet the divine treasure. The most formidable of these was a dragon of enormous proportions, a serpentine creature whose scales gleamed like polished obsidian and whose eyes burned with the same golden fire that illuminated the fleece. This beast, spawned from the union of earth and shadow through Aetes's magical arts, never slept, maintaining constant vigilance over the sacred grove. The dragon's presence transformed the grove into a place of supernatural dread. Its massive coils, each thicker than a man's torso, wrapped around the base of the great oak, while its wedge-shaped head swayed hypnotically among the branches. The creature's breath carried the scent of sulphur and ancient earth, while its voice, when it chose to speak, rumbled like distant thunder. Few mortals possessed the courage to approach within sight of the grove, and none had ever succeeded in penetrating its defences. Word of the Golden Fleece's location spread throughout the known world, carried by merchants, diplomats, and wandering storytellers. Tales of its supernatural properties grew with each telling, describing a treasure that could grant immortality, unlimited wealth, or divine favour to whoever possessed it. Kings and heroes from distant lands began to contemplate expeditions to claim the fleece, though none yet possessed the means or determination to challenge Aetes's magical defences. The king of Colchis welcomed these rumours, understanding that the fleece's reputation enhanced his own prestige while deterring potential enemies. However, his satisfaction was tempered by a growing unease that manifested in disturbing dreams and ominous portents. The court soothsayers reported unusual patterns in the flight of birds, while the priests of Ares observed troubling signs in their sacrificial rituals. These omens suggested that the fleece's presence in Colchis carried consequences beyond immediate prosperity. Seeking clarity about his kingdom's future, Aeetes dispatched his most trusted envoys to consult the oracle at Delphi. The journey across the Black Sea and through the treacherous waters of the Hellespont took months, but the king's need for divine guidance outweighed the risks and expenses involved. When his messengers finally returned, their faces bore the weight of prophecy that would haunt Aeetes for the remainder of his reign. The Pythia's words, delivered in the characteristic riddles of divine prophecy, spoke of a stranger who had come from the west, bearing the blessing of Hera and the determination of destiny itself. This foreign hero would claim the Golden Fleece despite all obstacles, and his success would mark the beginning of the end for Aeetes' rule over Colchis. The oracle provided no timeline for these events, leaving the king to wonder whether the prophesied threat would manifest in years, decades, or generations. The prophecy's impact on Aeetes was profound and immediate. The king, previously confident in his magical defences, and the grove's supernatural guardians, began to implement additional security measures around the fleece. He strengthened the dragon's binding spells, added new layers of protective enchantments to the grove, and stationed his most loyal warriors in concealed positions throughout the surrounding forest. Yet despite these precautions, the oracle's words gnawed at his peace of mind like a persistent wound. Meanwhile, far to the west in the kingdom of Iolcus, events were unfolding that would eventually fulfill the Delphic prophecy in ways that neither Aeetes nor any mortal could fully anticipate. The curse that had begun with Ino's treachery in Boeotia was spreading its tendrils across the Greek world, touching lives and shaping destinies according to patterns established by the fates themselves. In Iolcus, King Aeson ruled with wisdom and justice, beloved by his people for his fair judgments and generous spirit. His younger brother Pelias, however, possessed ambitions that far exceeded his legitimate claims to power. Where Aeson embodied the noble virtues of traditional kingship, Pelias displayed the cunning and ruthlessness of a man willing to sacrifice anything for personal advancement. The contrast between the brothers had been evident since childhood, but it was only as they reached maturity that this difference would manifest in actions that would reshape the political landscape of Thessaly. The political tension between Aeson and Pelias reached its breaking point during the harvest festival of 1285 BC, when Pelias openly challenged his brother's authority before the assembled nobles of Iolcus. The younger brother had spent years cultivating alliances among the kingdom's military commanders and wealthy merchants, promising them greater influence and richer rewards under his leadership. His arguments centred on Aeson's supposed weakness in dealing with neighbouring kingdoms and his reluctance to expand Iolcus' territory through military conquest. Pelias possessed the physical presence that many associated with strong leadership. Standing nearly a head taller than his brother, he carried himself with the confident swagger of a professional warrior. His dark hair was always meticulously groomed, his beard trimmed to emphasize the sharp angles of his jaw, and his clothing chosen to display both wealth and martial readiness. When he spoke in the assembly, his voice carried across the great hall with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The coup that followed was swift and decisive. Pelias had positioned his supporters strategically throughout the palace, ensuring that key locations were secured before Aeson could mount any effective resistance. The loyal guards who might have defended the rightful king found themselves outnumbered and isolated, their commanders having already declared for the usurper. By dawn of the following day, Pelias sat upon the throne of Iolcus, while his brother had been relegated to the status of a private citizen, stripped of all royal prerogatives but permitted to live under house arrest. Aeson's wife, Alcimede, daughter of the noble house of Phylacus, was pregnant at the time of the coup. The timing of her condition created additional complications for the new regime, as any male child born to the deposed king would represent a legitimate threat to Pelias's rule. The usurper's advisors counselled immediate action to eliminate this potential rival, but Pelias hesitated to order the outright murder of an infant, understanding that such brutality might provoke rebellion among those nobles who had reluctantly accepted his seizure of power. Alcimede, recognizing the mortal danger facing her unborn child, began planning for its protection even before labour commenced. She secretly contacted loyal servants who could be trusted with the most sensitive mission imaginable, spiriting away the future heir to safety beyond Peleus's reach. The network she assembled included household slaves who had served the royal family for decades, minor nobles whose loyalty to Aeson remained unshaken, and merchants whose trade routes extended far beyond the borders of Thessaly. When Jason was born on a stormy night in late autumn, the midwives who attended Alcimede were carefully chosen conspirators rather than the usual palace attendants. They immediately wrapped the newborn in simple cloth, rather than the purple swaddling traditionally reserved for royal infants, while Alcimede herself began spreading rumours that the child had been stillborn. The deception required her to maintain the appearance of devastating grief, a performance made easier by the genuine sorrow she felt at being separated from her son. The infant Jason was secretly transferred to a wet nurse in the countryside, a woman whose own child had died in birth and who desperately needed the generous payment offered for her services. For several months, the future hero lived in this humble farmhouse, gaining strength while his mother continued the elaborate charade of mourning in the palace. During this period, Alcimede worked through intermediaries to arrange Jason's placement with the most renowned educator in all of Greece, the centaur Chiron. Chiron's reputation extended far beyond his unusual parentage as the son of the titan Kronos and the ocean nymph Philyra. Unlike other centaurs, who were notorious for their drunkenness, violence, and lustful behaviour, Chiron embodied wisdom, restraint, and profound knowledge across multiple disciplines. His cave dwelling on Mount Pelion had become an informal academy where the sons of kings and heroes received education that no mortal teacher could provide. The centaur's immortal nature allowed him to accumulate knowledge across centuries, while his divine heritage granted him insights into both mortal and divine affairs. The journey to Mount Pelion required careful planning and absolute secrecy. Jason, now several months old and thriving under his wet nurse's care, was transported in a merchant's wagon loaded with wool and grain. The party included two of Aeson's most trusted retainers, disguised as travelling traders, along with the wet nurse who had remained with the child during his early years on the mountain. They travelled by night whenever possible, avoiding the main roads where Peleus's agents might recognise them. Mount Pelion itself rose from the Thessalian plain like a green fortress, its slopes covered with dense forests of oak, pine and fir trees that provided perfect concealment for Chiron's educational activities. The centaur's cave was located high on the mountain's eastern face, accessible only through narrow paths that wound between massive boulders and across rushing streams. The location offered both security and isolation, allowing Chiron students to focus on their studies without the distractions and dangers of court life. Chiron accepted Jason into his care with the solemnity befitting such a momentous responsibility. The centaur understood the political implications of harbouring the rightful heir to Iolcus, but his commitment to education and his personal friendship with Aeson outweighed any concerns about potential retaliation from Peleus. The arrangement would remain secret for nearly 2 decades, during which Jason would grow from infant to accomplished young man under the centaur's comprehensive tutelage. The curriculum that Chiron designed for his royal ward encompassed every skill considered essential for heroic leadership. Physical training began before Jason could walk properly, with exercises designed to develop strength, agility, and endurance. The centaur's approach emphasized practical application over theoretical knowledge, requiring his students to hunt their own food, construct their own shelters, and navigate the mountain's treacherous terrain without assistance. Archery instruction started when Jason reached his 7th year, using bows crafted specifically for his developing physique. Chiron had perfected techniques for teaching accuracy that surpassed those used by any mortal instructor, combining physical discipline with mental focus in ways that produced exceptional results. Jason learned to hit targets at distances that seemed impossible, to calculate wind resistance and trajectory instinctively, and to maintain accuracy even while running or riding. Medical knowledge formed another crucial component of Jason's education. Chiron possessed understanding of healing arts that rivaled Apollo himself, having learned the properties of every plant that grew on Mount Pelion and many others besides. Jason memorized the preparation of poultices for wounds, antidotes for various poisons, and surgical techniques for treating battle injuries. This medical training would prove invaluable during his future adventures, allowing him to treat wounded companions when no other help was available. Music and poetry received equal emphasis with martial skills in Chiron's educational philosophy. The centaur believed that a complete hero must possess cultural refinement alongside physical prowess, understanding that leadership required the ability to inspire through words as well as deeds. Jason learned to play the lyre with considerable skill, to compose verses in the traditional epic style, and to recite from memory the great works of earlier poets. These accomplishments would later serve him well in diplomatic situations, where cultural knowledge proved as important as military strength. Strategic thinking and tactical planning occupied much of Jason's later education. Chiron used elaborate war games to teach the principles of leadership, requiring his students to command mock armies in simulated battles across Mount Pelion's varied terrain. Jason learned to assess enemy strengths and weaknesses, to coordinate complex maneuvers involving multiple units, and to adapt his plans when unexpected circumstances arose. The Centaur's lessons emphasize the importance of inspiring loyalty among followers while maintaining clear chains of command. During Jason's time on Mount Pelion, he shared Chiron's instruction with several other young men who would later achieve fame as heroes in their own right. Asclepius, son of Apollo, studied alongside him and eventually surpassed even Chiron in medical knowledge. Actaeon, grandson of Cadmus, developed into a hunter of legendary skill before his tragic encounter with Artemis. Achilles would arrive later, after Jason had departed, but the Centaur's methods remained consistent across generations of students. The companionship Jason formed with his fellow students created bonds that would influence his entire life. These young men, all destined for greatness, developed mutual respect and friendship through shared hardships and achievements. They competed constantly but fairly, pushing each other to excel while maintaining the camaraderie essential for future cooperation. The relationships established on Mount Pelion would later prove crucial when Jason needed to recruit companions for his quest to Colchis. Meanwhile, in Iolcus, Pelias ruled with increasing paranoia as the years passed. The usurper had successfully consolidated his political control, eliminating potential rivals and rewarding his supporters with positions of influence. However, his satisfaction was constantly undermined by awareness that Aeson's son remained alive somewhere beyond his reach. Various attempts to locate Jason had failed, despite substantial rewards offered for information about the missing prince. The oracle at Delphi provided Pelias with guidance that increased rather than diminished his anxiety. When he consulted the Pythia about threats to his reign, the prophecy he received spoke of a man who would arrive wearing only one sandal, bringing with him the doom that the gods had prepared for the usurper. The oracle provided no timeline for this event, no description of the prophesied enemy beyond this single distinctive detail, and no guidance about how such a fate might be avoided. This prophecy became an obsession that dominated Pelias's thoughts and influenced his every decision. He stationed guards at all approaches to Iolcus with strict instructions to report anyone arriving with unusual footwear. Travellers who appeared with damaged or missing sandals were detained for questioning, though none proved to be the prophesied threat. The king's paranoia extended to his own court, where he began to suspect that enemies might deliberately remove a sandal to fulfill the oracle's words and claim divine sanction for rebellion. The irony of Pelias's situation was that his greatest fear would ultimately be realized through the intervention of the very goddess whose worship he had neglected. Hera, queen of the gods, had observed the usurper's rise to power with growing displeasure. The goddess valued legitimate authority and proper respect for divine will, both of which Peleus had violated through his coup against Aeson. Moreover, the usurper had failed to honour Hera with the sacrifices and festivals that were her due, focusing his religious observances on gods he considered more useful for maintaining military and political power. Hera's decision to intervene in mortal affairs reflected her complex relationship with justice and revenge. The goddess possessed the patience to wait decades for appropriate opportunities to punish those who had offended her. But her memory for slights was perfect, and her eventual retribution inevitable. In Jason, she recognized the perfect instrument for bringing about Peleus' downfall while simultaneously demonstrating divine support for legitimate royal authority. As Jason approached his 20th year, Chiron began to prepare him for departure from Mount Pelion. The centaur understood that the young man's education, however comprehensive, could only be completed through practical experience in the wider world. Moreover, political conditions in Iolcus had stabilized sufficiently that Jason's return would not immediately result in his death, though it would certainly precipitate a crisis that would test everything he had learned. The final months of Jason's education focused on leadership skills that could only be demonstrated through actual command responsibility. Chiron arranged for his student to lead hunting expeditions that required coordination of multiple participants, management of complex logistics, and decision-making under pressure. Jason's performance in these exercises confirmed the centaur's assessment that his royal ward possessed the natural charisma and tactical intelligence necessary for heroic leadership. When the time came for departure, Chiron equipped Jason with weapons and equipment befitting his royal status and heroic potential. The sword he received had been forged by divine craftsmen, its blade holding an edge that would never dull and its balance perfect for Jason's specific fighting style. The spear was similarly crafted, its bronze point capable of penetrating any mortal armour, while its ash shaft remained flexible enough to absorb the impact of heavy blows without breaking. Jason's clothing for the journey reflected his dual identity as both prince and hero. The tunic was woven from the finest wool, dyed in royal purple to proclaim his legitimate claim to the throne of Iolcus. Over this he wore a cloak fastened with a golden brooch, bearing the royal arms of his father's house. His sandals were crafted from the hide of a sacred bull, their bronze fittings polished to mirror brightness. The overall effect was to present Jason as unmistakably noble, while ensuring he possessed the practical equipment necessary for the dangerous journey ahead. The route from Mount Pelion to Iolcus required Jason to cross several rivers swollen by autumn rains. The most significant of these was the Anorus, which flowed from the mountain's northern slopes toward the sea near Iolcus itself. This river was known for its unpredictable currents and treacherous ford, where many travellers had lost their lives attempting to cross during periods of high water. When Jason reached the Anorus, he found its banks crowded with other travellers who were waiting for the water level to recede. Among them was an elderly woman whose apparent frailty and obvious distress immediately attracted his attention. She explained that she needed to cross the river urgently to reach her sick grandchild in a village on the opposite bank, but the current was far too strong for her to manage alone. Several younger travellers had already refused her requests for assistance, unwilling to risk their own safety for a stranger's convenience. Jason's response to this situation reflected the moral education he had received from Chiron as much as his natural generosity. Without hesitation, he offered to carry the old woman across the river, despite the obvious danger posed by the rushing water and slippery rocks. The woman accepted his offer with apparent gratitude, though her eyes held a gleam that suggested more than simple relief at finding assistance. The crossing proved even more treacherous than Jason had anticipated. The Anorus ran deeper than usual due to recent storms, its current strong enough to sweep away anyone who lost their footing. The riverbed was littered with smooth stones that provided uncertain purchase for his sandaled feet, while the old woman's weight made maintaining balance increasingly difficult. Halfway across, Jason felt his right sandal slip from his foot, carried away by the rushing water before he could retrieve it. Despite this setback, Jason continued across the river, determined to complete his charitable act regardless of personal inconvenience. The woman seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if she were drawing strength from his effort, but he persevered until they reached the far bank safely. Only then did the old woman reveal her true identity, transforming before Jason's startled eyes into the magnificent figure of Hera herself, radiant with divine power and terrible beauty. The goddess's revelation explained the supernatural difficulty of the crossing and the loss of Jason's sandal. Hera had orchestrated these events deliberately, testing Jason's character while simultaneously arranging for the fulfillment of the prophecy that would bring about Peleus's downfall. The missing sandal was not an accident, but a divine sign that would mark Jason as the instrument of the god's justice when he arrived in Iolcus. Hera's blessing carried both promise and obligation. The goddess pledged her support for Jason's eventual quest to reclaim his father's throne, but she also made clear that this support came with expectations. Jason would serve as her champion in matters that extended far beyond the borders of Iolcus, undertaking adventures that would test his courage, wisdom, and leadership abilities. The golden fleece in distant Colchis represented only the beginning of the trials that awaited him. With one sandal lost to the Anorus and the other still firmly attached to his left foot, Jason continued toward Iolcus, unaware that his distinctive appearance would soon fulfill the oracle's prophecy and set in motion events that would reshape the political landscape of Greece. The education he had received from Chiron, combined with Hera's divine favour, had prepared him for the challenges ahead, though the full magnitude of his destiny remained hidden in the mists of an uncertain future. The marketplace of Iolcus buzzed with its usual morning activity when Jason first appeared at the city gates, his distinctive appearance immediately drawing curious stares from merchants, craftsmen, and common citizens going about their daily business. The young man's noble bearing was unmistakable despite the dust of travel that clung to his purple tunic and the obvious fatigue that marked his features after the long journey from Mount Pelion. His muscular frame, developed through years of Chiron's rigorous training, moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, while his sun-bronzed skin and calloused hands testified to a life spent outdoors rather than in palace luxury. What truly captured attention, however, was the peculiar state of his footwear. Jason's left foot bore a magnificently crafted sandal of tanned bullhide, its bronze fittings gleaming in the morning sunlight, and its leather straps wound precisely around his calf in the manner favoured by nobility. His right foot, in stark contrast, was completely bare, the pale skin unmarked by sandal straps standing out against his otherwise travel-darkened appearance. The asymmetry was so pronounced that even casual observers found their eyes drawn to this unusual detail. Word of the stranger's arrival spread through Iolcus, with the speed characteristic of all significant gossip in a closely knit community. Servants hurried to inform their masters, merchants paused in their negotiations to discuss the newcomer's identity, and children followed at a safe distance, fascinated by someone who clearly belonged to their social betters, yet appeared in such an unconventional state. By the time Jason reached the central agora, a substantial crowd had gathered to witness whatever events might unfold. The palace guards, who had been stationed throughout the city since Peleus's rise to power, recognized immediately that this arrival matched the prophetic description that had haunted their king for nearly 2 decades. Their training emphasized the importance of reporting unusual visitors, but the specific instructions regarding anyone wearing only one sandal had been drilled into them with particular emphasis. Several guards departed immediately for the palace, their urgent pace communicating the significance of their message even before they reached the royal chambers. Pelias received the news while conducting his morning audience with petitioners and minor officials, a routine administrative session that had been proceeding without incident until the breathless guard burst through the chamber doors. The king's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face drained of colour, his hands gripped the arms of his throne until his knuckles whitened, and his voice caught momentarily before he could form coherent words. The assembled courtiers, witnessing their ruler's obvious distress, fell silent with the uncomfortable awareness that they were observing something of profound importance. The usurper's mind raced through possibilities as he struggled to maintain his composure before the watching crowd. 20 years of anticipating this moment had not prepared him for the actual reality of its arrival. Every contingency plan he had developed, every strategy he had considered for dealing with the prophesied threat, suddenly seemed inadequate when faced with the immediate need for action. Yet Pelias had not maintained his grip on power for 2 decades without possessing considerable political acumen, and his recovery from the initial shock was swift and decisive. Rather than ordering the immediate arrest or assassination of the mysterious visitor, Pelias chose a more subtle approach that would allow him to assess the situation while maintaining the appearance of royal dignity. He commanded his guards to escort the stranger to the palace with full honours, as befitted any noble visitor to Iolcus. This decision reflected both his political cunning and his awareness that hasty action might provoke exactly the kind of popular unrest that could threaten his regime. The formal escort that accompanied Jason through the streets of Iolcus transformed his arrival from a curious spectacle into a procession of genuine significance. The palace guards, resplendent in their bronze armour and crimson cloaks, formed a protective formation around the young man while maintaining the respectful distance appropriate for an honoured guest rather than a prisoner. This treatment sent a clear message to the watching populace that their king regarded the visitor as someone deserving of royal attention. Jason's own demeanour during this escort revealed the quality of his education under Chiron's guidance. He neither displayed nervousness at the sudden attention, nor affected the arrogance that might be expected from someone of obvious noble birth. Instead, he maintained the composed dignity of a man comfortable with his own worth while remaining alert to the political undercurrent swirling around his arrival. His responses to the curious stares of the crowd were measured and appropriate, acknowledging their interest without encouraging familiarity. The throne room of Iolcus reflected Pelias's taste for displays of wealth and power that would intimidate visitors while reinforcing his own authority. Massive columns of polished marble supported a vaulted ceiling decorated with frescoes depicting the military victories that had established his rule, while the floor was paved with stones imported from distant quarries at enormous expense. The throne itself was carved from a single block of black granite, its surface inlaid with gold and precious gems in patterns that caught and reflected the light from bronze braziers positioned throughout the hall. Pelias had arranged himself carefully for this crucial encounter, wearing his most magnificent robes of state and ensuring that his most loyal supporters occupied prominent positions throughout the chamber. The king understood that this meeting would be observed and discussed by everyone present, making the management of appearances as important as the substance of whatever conversation might ensue. His crown, a masterwork of goldsmithing that incorporated symbols of both divine favour and earthly power, caught the light dramatically as he leaned forward to study the approaching visitor. The moment when Jason entered the throne room and walked steadily toward the royal dais marked the fulfilment of the Delphic prophecy that had haunted Pelias for 20 years. Every eye in the chamber focused on the young man's distinctive footwear, or rather the absence of footwear on his right foot, confirming beyond doubt that this was indeed the prophesied threat to the usurper's reign. The silence that filled the vast space was broken only by the soft sound of Jason's remaining sandal against the marble floor, and the barely audible whisper of fabric as courtiers shifted nervously in their positions. Jason's recognition of his uncle was immediate despite the passage of 2 decades since their last meeting. Pelias had aged considerably during his years on the throne, his hair now completely grey and his face marked by the lines that came from constant vigilance against potential threats. Yet his essential character remained unchanged. The calculating intelligence behind his eyes, the careful control of his expression, and the aura of barely contained violence that had always marked him as dangerous. The family resemblance between the brothers was still evident, though Pelias had grown heavier and more imposing during his years of royal living. When Jason finally spoke, his voice carried clearly through the throne room with the trained projection that Chiron had taught him for addressing large assemblies. He identified himself simply as the son of Aeson, making no immediate claim to royal titles or inherited authority, but establishing his lineage in terms that no one present could misunderstand. The directness of this approach reflected both his confidence in his legitimate status and his awareness that elaborate explanations would be unnecessary, given the obvious recognition he could see in his uncle's expression. Pelias's response demonstrated the political skill that had enabled him to maintain power for 20 years despite the constant threat of rebellion or invasion. Rather than reacting with hostility or attempting to deny Jason's identity, the king welcomed his nephew with apparent warmth while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of his claim to the throne. This strategy allowed Pelias to appear magnanimous while buying time to develop a more permanent solution to the threat Jason represented. The conversation that followed was conducted with the formal courtesy appropriate to a public audience, but every word carried layers of meaning that were not lost on the experienced courtiers observing the exchange. Pelias inquired about Jason's education and travels with the interest of a concerned uncle, while Jason responded with respect but without the deference that might suggest acceptance of his uncle's authority. Both men understood that they were engaged in a deadly serious political negotiation despite the superficial pleasantness of their interaction. The turning point came when Pelias, with apparent spontaneity but obvious calculation, posed a hypothetical question to his nephew. He asked what Jason would do if faced with a subject whose very existence threatened his legitimate rule, framing the inquiry as a test of the young man's wisdom and judgment rather than a direct threat. This approach allowed the king to gauge Jason's character while simultaneously beginning to plant the seeds of the solution he was already formulating. Jason's answer revealed both his noble character and his political naivety. He responded that a wise ruler would find a way to channel such a person's energy toward goals that would benefit the kingdom while removing them from the immediate political situation. This response, while demonstrating admirable principles, also provided Pelias with exactly the opening he needed to propose his carefully conceived plan. The king's proposal emerged gradually through what appeared to be casual conversation about the great deeds that brought honour to kingdoms and glory to heroes. Pelias spoke of legendary quests undertaken by previous generations, emphasising how such adventures had elevated both the heroes who completed them and the rulers who sponsored their expeditions. He mentioned specifically the fame that had come to King Eurystheus through his association with Heracles' labours, suggesting that similar opportunities for mutual benefit might exist for rulers wise enough to recognise them. The mention of the Golden Fleece appeared to arise naturally from this discussion of heroic enterprises, though Pelias had been steering the conversation toward this topic from the beginning. He described the treasure in terms that emphasised both its legendary status and the glory that would come to anyone bold enough to attempt its recovery. The king's presentation made the quest sound like an honour being offered rather than an exile being imposed, a subtle but crucial distinction that would make Jason's acceptance appear voluntary rather than coerced. Pelias's description of Colchis and the challenges facing any potential expedition was carefully calibrated to intrigue rather than discourage his nephew. He spoke of King Aeetes' reputation as a sorcerer, the supernatural guardians protecting the fleece, and the treacherous journey across the Black Sea in terms that would appeal to a young man trained for heroic adventure. the king understood that Jason's education under Chiron had prepared him for exactly this type of challenge, making the quest appear achievable rather than impossible. The political implications of the proposed expedition were presented as entirely secondary to its heroic aspects. Pelias suggested that success in such an undertaking would establish Jason's reputation throughout the Greek world, providing him with the credentials necessary for future leadership roles. The king implied that his own advanced age and lack of direct heirs meant that Iolces would eventually need a successor, and that a nephew who had proven himself through great deeds would be an obvious candidate for such succession. This masterful manipulation appealed simultaneously to Jason's sense of honour, his desire for adventure, and his legitimate ambitions for political authority. Pelias had effectively transformed the prophetic threat represented by his nephew's arrival into an opportunity to eliminate that threat, while appearing to act in Jason's best interests. The proposal was structured so that refusal would seem cowardly, while acceptance would remove Jason from Iolcus for what might prove to be a permanent exile. Jason's acceptance of the challenge came after a pause that suggested careful consideration rather than impulsive enthusiasm. His education under Chiron had taught him to evaluate opportunities thoroughly, but it had also instilled in him the heroic values that made such a quest irresistible regardless of its political implications. The young man understood that he was being manoeuvred into a dangerous situation, but his confidence in his own abilities and his trust in divine favour made the risks seem manageable. The formal announcement of Jason's acceptance created an immediate sensation throughout the throne room, and within hours throughout the entire city of Iolcus. News of a quest to recover the Golden Fleece spread with extraordinary speed, carried by servants, merchants, and visitors who had witnessed the historic exchange. The prospect of such an expedition captured the imagination of a generation raised on stories of heroic adventures but lacking opportunities for similar achievements in their own lives. Jason's immediate preparations for the expedition demonstrated both his practical intelligence and his understanding of the magnitude of the task he had accepted. Rather than attempting to undertake the quest alone or with only a small group of companions, he recognized that success would require assembling a crew of exceptional individuals whose combined skills could overcome the various challenges they would face. This decision reflected the collaborative approach to leadership that Chiron had emphasized throughout his education. The recruitment process began with Jason's dispatch of messengers to heroes throughout the Greek world, carrying invitations to join an expedition that promised both glory and substantial material rewards. These messages were carefully crafted to appeal to different types of potential recruits. Some emphasized the honor of the undertaking, others stressed the adventure and excitement, while still others mentioned the practical benefits that would come to successful participants. The response to Jason's call exceeded even his optimistic expectations. Within weeks, heroes began arriving in Iolcus from kingdoms and city-states across the known world, drawn by the combination of Jason's growing reputation and the legendary status of their proposed objective. These men represented the finest examples of their generation's heroic ideals, each bringing unique skills and abilities that would prove essential to the expedition's success. The construction of the vessel that would carry Jason and his companions to Colchis began immediately upon the arrival of Argus, the master shipbuilder whose reputation for crafting vessels of extraordinary quality had spread throughout the maritime communities of the Aegean. Argus hailed from Thespiae in Boeotia, where his family had served as naval architects for 3 generations, each passing down techniques and secrets that elevated their craft far above the work of ordinary shipwrights. His weathered hands bore the permanent stains of pitch and wood oils, while his keen eyes could assess the quality of timber with a glance that revealed decades of experience in selecting materials for vessels intended to survive the most challenging voyages. The location chosen for the ship's construction was a sheltered cove near Pagesae, the principal port of Iolcus, where the necessary materials could be assembled without interference from the curious crowds that had gathered to witness every aspect of the expedition's preparation. The site offered access to fresh water for the lengthy process of seasoning and shaping the hull timbers, while its proximity to established trade routes ensured that exotic materials required for the vessel's construction could be obtained without excessive delay or expense. Argus's first task involved selecting the primary timber that would form the ship's backbone and hull. He rejected the local pine and oak that would have sufficed for ordinary merchant vessels, instead dispatching agents to the sacred groves of Mount Pelion, where trees of exceptional size and strength grew under divine protection. These ancient forests contained specimens that had weathered centuries of storms and seasonal changes, their wood possessing the density and resilience necessary for a vessel that would face supernatural as well as natural hazards. The most crucial timber came from an entirely different source, one that elevated the ship's construction from mere craftsmanship to divine collaboration. Athena herself appeared to Argus during the early stages of construction, her sudden manifestation in the shipyard causing the assembled workers to prostrate themselves in terror and awe. The goddess wore the aspect of a master craftsman rather than a warrior, her usual armour replaced by a simple chiton that allowed freedom of movement, while her hands bore the calluses and tool marks that identified her as a patron of skilled artisans. Athena's contribution to the vessel took the form of a massive beam hewn from one of the sacred oaks of Dodona, Zeus's primary oracle site in northwestern Greece. This timber possessed properties that transcended normal wood, having absorbed prophetic powers from decades of exposure to divine communications. The beam's grain displayed patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed closely, while its surface remained warm to the touch regardless of ambient temperature. When properly incorporated into the ship's structure, this sacred wood would provide the vessel with guidance and protection that no mortal navigation could match. The goddess supervised the beam's installation personally, directing Argus and his workers in techniques that combined traditional shipbuilding methods with divine inspiration. The sacred timber was positioned as the ship's speaking prow, carved into the likeness of a woman's head whose features bore a subtle resemblance to Athena herself. This figurehead would serve as the vessel's voice, providing warnings of danger and guidance through treacherous waters when the expedition faced its greatest challenges. The ship's overall design reflected Argus's understanding that this vessel would need to accommodate a larger crew than typical merchant ships, while maintaining the speed and maneuverability necessary for both military action and rapid escape. The hull measured approximately 150 feet from stem to stern, with a beam of 25 feet that provided stability in rough seas, without sacrificing the shallow draft essential for navigating unfamiliar rivers and coastal waters. The design incorporated 50 rowing positions, allowing the crew to maintain progress even when wind conditions prevented the effective use of sails. The construction process required nearly 3 months of intensive labour, with skilled craftsmen working from dawn to dusk under Argus's exacting supervision. Each component was carefully shaped and fitted using techniques that had been refined over generations, while the sacred timber from Dodona received special treatment that involved ritual purification and blessing ceremonies conducted by priests of Athena. The goddess herself returned periodically to inspect the work's progress, offering suggestions and corrections that ensured the vessel would meet the extraordinary demands of its intended voyage. The ship's name, Argo, derived from its builder's own designation, though the vessel quickly acquired a reputation that transcended its creator's individual fame. As word of its construction spread throughout the Greek world, the name became synonymous with adventure, divine favour, and the pursuit of seemingly impossible goals. The vessel's completion marked not just the end of a construction project, but the creation of a legend that would inspire future generations of mariners and explorers. While Argus laboured over the ship's physical construction, Jason focused his attention on assembling the crew that would make the expedition possible. His recruitment efforts had attracted responses from heroes throughout the known world, but selecting the final roster required careful consideration of each candidate's skills, temperament, and ability to work effectively with others during the extended voyage ahead. The process resembled the formation of an elite military unit more than the typical hiring of sailors for a merchant expedition. Heracles arrived in Iolcus, accompanied by his usual companion Hylas, a young man whose beauty had captivated the hero during one of his earlier adventures. The son of Zeus possessed a physical presence that dominated any gathering, his massive frame clothed in the hide of the Nemean lion, and his club resting casually across his shoulder as if it weighed nothing at all. His reputation preceded him through stories that had grown with each telling, though even the most exaggerated accounts failed to capture the full impact of encountering the hero in person. His voice rumbled like distant thunder when he spoke, while his movements displayed the controlled power of someone accustomed to restraining strength that could easily prove destructive. The inclusion of Heracles in the expedition provided both tremendous advantages and potential complications that Jason had to consider carefully. The hero's combat abilities were unmatched among mortals, his experience in facing supernatural opponents was extensive, and his presence would lend credibility to the entire enterprise. However, Heracles also possessed an independent nature that made him difficult to command, while his tendency to pursue personal interests sometimes conflicted with group objectives. Jason's decision to welcome him aboard reflected confidence in his own leadership abilities and recognition that the quest's success might depend on having access to Heracles' extraordinary capabilities. Orpheus brought an entirely different set of skills to the expedition, though his contributions would prove equally valuable in their own way. The son of Apollo possessed musical abilities that transcended normal human talent. His voice and lyre capable of charming wild beasts, moving stones, and even influencing the gods themselves. His appearance reflected his divine parentage through features that seemed almost too perfect for mortal flesh, while his movements possessed the fluid grace characteristic of those blessed by the Muses. The bard's reputation extended far beyond entertainment, as his music had proven capable of achieving practical results that more conventional approaches could not match. The recruitment of Orpheus demonstrated Jason's sophisticated understanding of the challenges his expedition would face. The journey to Colchis would require more than martial prowess and seamanship. Success would depend on the crew's ability to navigate diplomatic situations, overcome supernatural obstacles, and maintain morale during extended periods of danger and uncertainty. Orpheus's presence provided solutions to problems that could not be addressed through conventional means, while his cultural refinement would prove valuable in dealing with foreign rulers and their courts. Castor and Pollux, the twin sons of Leda, arrived together as they did everything else, their complementary skills making them a formidable team despite their different divine parentage. Castor, whose mortal father was Tyndareus of Sparta, had developed into the finest horseman of his generation, capable of managing even the most spirited steeds with apparent ease. His brother Pollux, fathered by Zeus himself, possessed boxing skills that had never been matched in formal competition, his fists moving with speed that seemed to blur the air around them. Both twins shared the striking good looks characteristic of their family line, though Pollux's divine heritage showed in the golden highlights that appeared in his hair when sunlight struck it directly. The inclusion of the Dioscuri, as the twins were collectively known, brought expertise in mounted warfare and hand-to-hand combat that would complement the expedition's other military capabilities. More importantly, the reputation for loyalty and teamwork provided Jason with crew members he could trust completely during critical situations. The twins had never been separated for extended periods, and their willingness to join the expedition together demonstrated their commitment to seeing the quest through to completion, regardless of the obstacles they might encounter. Atalanta's potential inclusion in the expedition created considerable controversy among the assembled heroes, reflecting the complex attitudes toward female participation in martial endeavours that characterized Greek society of the period. The huntress from Arcadia possessed skills with bow and spear that rivaled those of any male warrior, while her speed afoot had never been matched in formal competition. Her reputation included victories over seasoned hunters in contests that tested tracking, marksmanship and wilderness survival, establishing her credentials as a formidable addition to any expedition requiring such abilities. The debate over Atalanta's participation revealed tensions within the group that Jason had to address carefully to maintain unity among his recruits. Some heroes, particularly those from more conservative regions, argued that the presence of a woman aboard ship would bring bad luck while creating unnecessary complications during a voyage that would test everyone's endurance and discipline. Others, including Heracles himself, supported her inclusion based purely on merit, arguing that the expedition's success should take priority over traditional customs that might limit their effectiveness. Jason's handling of this controversy demonstrated the diplomatic skills that Chiron had emphasized throughout his education. Rather than making an arbitrary decision that might alienate either faction, he established criteria for crew selection based on demonstrated ability and commitment to the expedition's goals. This approach allowed him to evaluate Atalanta's qualifications objectively, while avoiding direct confrontation with those who opposed her participation on principle. The Huntress's eventual inclusion in some versions of the expedition roster reflected her exceptional skills rather than any attempt to challenge social conventions for their own sake. The diversity of backgrounds represented among the assembled heroes created a microcosm of the entire Greek world, with representatives from major kingdoms, city-states and tribal regions bringing their distinctive cultural perspectives and specialized knowledge to the common enterprise. Admetus of Pherae contributed expertise in animal husbandry and agricultural management that would prove valuable during extended periods ashore, while his experience as a ruler provided insights into diplomatic protocol that could facilitate negotiations with foreign potentates. Ancaeus of Tegea brought naval expertise gained through years of commanding merchant vessels in the dangerous waters around the Peloponnese, his knowledge of currents, weather patterns and navigation techniques complementing Argus's shipbuilding skills. The mariner's scarred hands and sun-weathered face testified to decades of experience, dealing with the sea's unpredictable moods, while his calm demeanour under pressure had been proven through numerous encounters with pirates, storms and other maritime hazards. Euphemus of Tinarum possessed the unusual ability to run across water surfaces without sinking, a gift that would prove invaluable for reconnaissance missions and emergency situations where conventional boats could not be employed safely. His divine parentage through Poseidon manifested in this supernatural connection to aquatic environments, allowing him to serve as a scout and messenger in circumstances where other crew members would be helpless. The inclusion of seers and prophets among the expedition's roster reflected Jason's understanding that success would require supernatural guidance as well as mortal effort. Idmon, son of Apollo, possessed prophetic abilities that had proven accurate in previous situations, though his visions often came with cryptic warnings that required careful interpretation. Mopsus of Lapithae brought expertise in reading omens from bird flight and other natural phenomena, his skills complementing Idmon's more direct prophetic gifts. The medical needs of the expedition were addressed through the recruitment of Asclepius, whose training under Chiron had developed into healing abilities that approached the divine. The physician's presence would prove crucial during the inevitable injuries and illnesses that would affect crew members during their extended voyage, while his knowledge of foreign diseases and their treatments could mean the difference between life and death in unfamiliar environments. The final crew selection process involved extensive discussions among the heroes themselves, as Jason encouraged input from all potential participants regarding the expedition's organisation and objectives. These conversations revealed the high level of mutual respect that existed among the assembled heroes, despite their diverse backgrounds and occasionally conflicting personalities. The willingness of such renowned individuals to subordinate their egos to collective leadership demonstrated both Jason's natural charisma and the compelling nature of their shared goal. The blessing ceremonies that preceded the Argo's launch involved priests from multiple temples, reflecting the expedition's need for divine favour from various sources. Athena's continued involvement ensured the ship's structural integrity and navigational capabilities, while sacrifices to Poseidon sought the sea god's protection during their maritime journey. Apollo received offerings intended to secure favourable winds and accurate prophecies, while Hera's blessing acknowledged her role as patron of the entire enterprise. The launch itself took place at dawn, on a day when the omens were unanimously favourable, with clear skies, gentle winds and bird flights that the expedition's seers interpreted as signs of divine approval. The assembled crowd included not only the heroes who would crew the vessel, but also representatives from throughout the Greek world who had come to witness this historic departure. King Peleus himself attended the ceremony, maintaining his facade of supportive uncle while privately hoping that he was witnessing the last he would ever see of his nephew and the prophetic threat he represented. The Argo slid into the waters of Pagasai with the smooth grace that marked Argus's masterful construction, her sacred timber from Dodona speaking words of encouragement that only the crew could hear clearly. The vessel's response to the water demonstrated the perfect balance that the shipbuilder had achieved between stability and speed, while the prophetic figurehead turned to face the open sea with an expression of eager anticipation. As the heroes took their positions at the rowing benches and Jason assumed his place at the steering oar, the magnitude of their undertaking became clear to everyone present. They were embarking on a journey that would test every skill they possessed, while facing dangers that no previous expedition had encountered. The Golden Fleece awaited them in distant Colchis, protected by supernatural guardians and the sorcerous power of King Aeetes, but their confidence in their collective abilities and divine favour made success seem achievable despite the obvious risks. The first stroke of the oars sent the Argo moving steadily away from the harbour, her wake spreading behind her in a pattern that seemed to point toward destiny itself. The greatest heroes of their generation had assembled under Jason's leadership, their ship blessed by the gods and equipped with prophetic guidance that would see them through the trials ahead. The age of heroes was reaching its culmination in this single expedition that would determine not only their individual fates, but the future of heroic endeavour throughout the Greek world. The Argo's departure from Pegasi marked the beginning of trials that would test not only the heroes' individual capabilities, but their ability to function as a unified crew under Jason's leadership. The vessel's initial progress across the calm waters of the Pagasetic Gulf provided a deceptive sense of ease, with favourable winds filling the great square sail, while the rhythmic stroke of 50 oars propelled them steadily toward the open Aegean. The prophetic figurehead carved from Dodona's sacred oak remained silent during these early hours, its wooden features gazing ahead with an expression that suggested patient watchfulness rather than immediate concern. The crew's first major test came as they rounded Cape Sepias, where the treacherous currents that had claimed numerous vessels over the centuries created conditions that demanded expert seamanship. Ancaeus of Tegea took the steering oar during this passage, his decades of maritime experience enabling him to read the subtle signs that warned of hidden dangers beneath the surface. The water's colour shifted from deep blue to an ominous green-black, where underwater rocks created turbulence, while the wind patterns changed unpredictably as air currents deflected off the cape's towering cliffs. Several crew members who had never experienced serious ocean sailing found themselves struggling with seasickness as the Argo encountered the first significant swells beyond the protection of the mainland. Heracles, despite his legendary strength, proved particularly susceptible to the vessel's motion, his massive frame hunched over the rail as his stomach rebelled against the unfamiliar environment. The sight of the world's greatest hero reduced to such vulnerability provided a sobering reminder that even supernatural abilities had their limitations, when confronted with the sea's relentless power. The island of Lemnos appeared on the horizon after 3 days of steady sailing, its mountainous profile rising from the sea like a fortress built by titans. The landmass stretched approximately 25 miles from east to west, its highest peaks reaching nearly 3,000 feet above sea level, and creating their own weather patterns that manifested as clouds clinging to the summits, even when the surrounding sky remained clear. The island's strategic position in the northern Aegean had made it a crucial waypoint for maritime trade, while its rich volcanic soil supported agriculture that could sustain a substantial population. As the Argo approached Lemnos's principal harbour, the absence of normal port activity became immediately apparent to the experienced mariners among the crew. No fishing boats dotted the coastal waters, no merchant vessels lay anchored in the protected bay, and no smoke rose from the cooking fires that should have marked a thriving community. The harbour facilities themselves appeared intact, with stone piers and wooden docks showing no signs of storm damage or military destruction, yet an eerie stillness pervaded the entire scene. The first inhabitants to appear along the shoreline were women, dozens of them emerging from buildings and pathways with a coordination that suggested they had been watching the Argo's approach for some time. Their clothing was well maintained and their bearing confident, yet something in their manner struck the observant heroes as subtly wrong. These women moved with the purposeful stride of those accustomed to authority, their eyes holding a hardness that seemed inconsistent with the welcoming gestures they displayed toward the arriving vessel. Queen Hypsipyle led the delegation that greeted the Argonauts as they secured their ship to the harbour's main pier. She possessed the regal bearing appropriate to her royal status, her dark hair elaborately braided with the golden ornaments, and her purple-dyed robes indicating both wealth and political authority. Her beauty was undeniable, with features that combined classical Greek proportions with the exotic appeal that often characterized inhabitants of the Aegean islands, yet her smile never quite reached her eyes, which held depths that suggested experiences no woman should have endured. The explanation Hypsipyle provided for the absence of men on Lemnos was carefully crafted to elicit sympathy, while concealing the horrific truth of recent events. She spoke of a plague that had selectively afflicted the island's male population, describing symptoms that the expedition's medical experts found plausible despite their inability to examine any actual victims. According to the Queen's account, the disease had struck suddenly and with devastating effect, leaving the women to manage all aspects of island life while hoping for the eventual return of their menfolk from trading expeditions that had departed before the plague's onset. The Lemnian women's hospitality exceeded anything the heroes had experienced in their previous travels, with elaborate feasts prepared using the island's finest provisions and entertainment provided by skilled musicians and dancers. Individual crew members found themselves the objects of particular attention, from women whose beauty and charm seemed designed to make visitors forget any thoughts of continuing their journey. The accommodations offered to the Argonauts surpassed those typically available even to visiting royalty, with private chambers prepared for each hero and servants assigned to attend to their every need. Jason's growing unease about the situation reflected both his natural caution and specific warnings he had received from the Argo's prophetic figurehead during quiet moments when other crew members were distracted by their host's entertainment. The sacred timber from Dodona whispered of blood soaked into Lemnos's soil, of screams that had echoed across the island during recent nights, and of women whose hands bore stains that no amount of washing could completely remove. These cryptic warnings, combined with his own observations of inconsistencies in Hypsipyle's explanations, convinced Jason that their hosts were concealing secrets that posed potential danger to his crew. The truth about Lemnos's recent history was far more disturbing than any plague could have been. The island's women had indeed eliminated their menfolk, but through coordinated violence rather than disease. The massacre had been triggered by the men's decision to take Thracian concubines during trading expeditions, bringing these foreign women back to Lemnos as secondary wives, while relegating their original spouses to subordinate status within their own households. The insult to the Lemnian women's honour and the threat to their children's inheritance rights had festered until it exploded into murderous rage. The killings had been systematic and thorough, planned with the same attention to detail that the women had previously applied to managing their households and raising their children. Husbands had been poisoned during evening meals, brothers eliminated while they slept, and fathers struck down by daughters they had trusted completely. The Thracian concubines had suffered even worse fates, their foreign origins making them convenient scapegoats for all the accumulated resentments that had motivated the massacre. Hypsipyle herself had participated in the violence, though her royal status had allowed her to direct others in the actual killing while maintaining some psychological distance from the bloodshed. The Queen's father had died by her own hand, poisoned wine administered during what he believed was a reconciliation dinner, following an argument about his latest Thracian acquisition. The old king's death throes had been prolonged and agonizing, his daughter watching with satisfaction as he finally understood the price of dishonouring the women who had borne his children and managed his kingdom. The aftermath of the massacre had left Lemnos's women in complete control of the island's resources, but facing the practical problem of ensuring their society's continuation. Without men to father children, the community faced extinction within a generation, making the arrival of the Argonauts appear to be a gift from the gods themselves. The heroes represented not only potential husbands and fathers, but also the genetic diversity necessary to prevent the inbreeding that would inevitably result from too small a population base. Several crew members succumbed completely to the Lemnian women's seductive campaign, abandoning all thoughts of continuing the quest in favour of the comfortable life being offered on the island. These heroes found themselves assigned individual partners whose beauty and attentiveness made the prospect of remaining permanently on Lemnos increasingly attractive with each passing day. The women's approach was sophisticated and patient, gradually escalating their emotional and physical involvement with their chosen targets, while carefully avoiding any appearance of desperation or manipulation. Heracles proved immune to these temptations, his focus remaining fixed on the expedition's ultimate objective, despite the obvious attractions of extended rest and luxury. The hero's resistance stemmed partly from his awareness of the women's deception, which his extensive experience with supernatural dangers had taught him to recognize, and partly from his own complex relationship with feminine companionship, following various traumatic experiences in his past adventures. His growing impatience with the delay began to manifest in increasingly pointed comments about the crew's dedication to their sworn mission. The breaking point came when Heracles discovered evidence of the massacre that Hypsipyle and her followers had worked so carefully to conceal. While exploring the island's interior during what was supposed to be a hunting expedition, he encountered a hastily constructed burial ground where the bodies of Lemnos's men had been interred without the proper funeral rites that Greek custom demanded. The shallow graves had been disturbed by scavenging animals, revealing decomposing corpses that showed clear signs of violent death rather than disease-related mortality. Heracles' confrontation with Jason about his discoveries forced the expedition's leader to acknowledge what he had already begun to suspect based on the Argo's prophetic warnings. The evidence of mass murder, combined with the increasingly obvious attempts to prevent the crew's departure, made it clear that Lemnos represented a trap that could potentially destroy the entire expedition if they remained much longer. The women's ultimate intentions, whether simply to detain the heroes permanently or to eliminate them if they proved uncooperative, remained unclear, but the danger was undeniable. The departure from Lemnos required careful planning to avoid provoking the kind of violent confrontation that had eliminated the island's previous male population. Jason announced their intention to leave as a temporary measure, claiming that divine omens required them to continue their journey, but promising to return once their mission was completed. This approach allowed the women to maintain their facade of innocent hospitality, while providing the Argonauts with a face-saving excuse for their hasty exit. The actual departure took place at dawn, with the crew quietly boarding the Argo, while most of their hosts remained asleep after the previous evening's farewell celebration. Several heroes had to be physically removed from their chambers, their intoxication with wine and feminine attention making them reluctant to abandon the comfort they had found on Lemnos. The women who discovered the departure in progress made no attempt to prevent it through force, though their expressions of betrayed fury provided a glimpse of the violence they were capable of unleashing when their desires were thwarted. The Argo's passage across the northern Aegean toward the entrance to the Hellespont proceeded without incident for several days, the crew gradually recovering from their experiences on Lemnos while refocusing their attention on the challenges that lay ahead. The favourable winds that had carried them away from the island of murderous women continued to fill their sail, while the rhythmic stroke of the oars maintained their progress during periods of calm. The prophetic figurehead remained silent, its wooden features suggesting satisfaction with their escape from immediate danger. The loss of Heracles occurred during what should have been a routine stop for fresh water and supplies along the coast of Mysia, a region known for its friendly relations with Greek traders and travellers. The landing site chosen by Ancaeus offered excellent protection from offshore winds, while providing access to a stream that descended from the forested hills through a series of picturesque waterfalls. The local inhabitants, members of a pastoral tribe that had maintained peaceful relations with previous Greek expeditions, welcomed the Argonauts with the hospitality traditionally offered to travellers under divine protection. Hylas, Heracles' beloved companion, volunteered to lead the water-gathering expedition that would replenish the Argo supplies for the next stage of their journey. The young man's beauty had only intensified during the voyage, his exposure to sea air and physical labour developing his naturally graceful physique, while adding a healthy bronze colour to skin that had previously been pale from indoor living. His enthusiasm for exploring new territories had made him the popular member of the crew, while his devotion to Heracles provided stability for the hero's sometimes volatile temperament. The spring that served as the expedition's water source was located in a grove sacred to the local nymphs, its crystal-clear waters emerging from beneath moss-covered rocks to form a pool that reflected the surrounding trees like a perfect mirror. The site possessed an otherworldly tranquility that seemed to muffle normal forest sounds while enhancing the musical quality of the flowing water. Ancient olive trees provided shade around the pool's perimeter, their gnarled trunks and silvery leaves creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted constantly with the movement of their branches. The water nymphs who inhabited this sacred grove had observed Hylas's approach with growing fascination, his extraordinary beauty awakening desires that had remained dormant during the long years since any mortal of comparable attractiveness had visited their domain. These supernatural beings possessed an ethereal loveliness that surpassed human standards, their forms seeming to shimmer between corporeal existence and pure spirit as they moved through their aquatic environment. Their voices, when they chose to speak, carried the musical quality of flowing water over smooth stones. As Hylas knelt beside the pool to fill his water jars, the nymphs emerged from their concealment among the reeds and water lilies that fringed the spring's edges. Their appearance was gradual and hypnotic, beginning with glimpses of pale limbs beneath the water's surface before they rose completely into view, with movements that seemed to defy normal physical laws. The young man found himself transfixed by their supernatural beauty, his mission forgotten as he gazed into eyes that reflected the depths of the pool itself. The nymph's seduction of Hylas was accomplished through means that transcended mere physical attraction, involving magical compulsions that overwhelmed his mortal will while promising pleasures beyond human experience. They spoke to him in voices that seemed to emanate from the water itself, describing the eternal bliss that awaited those who abandoned mortal concerns to join their timeless existence beneath the spring's surface. Their touch, when they finally made contact with his skin, carried the cool refreshment of pure water combined with an electric sensation that sent waves of pleasure through his entire nervous system. Heracles' discovery of his companion's disappearance triggered a search effort that demonstrated both his devotion to Hylas and his growing desperation as the hours passed without any trace of the missing young man. The hero's massive frame crashed through the forest undergrowth with the force of a landslide, his voice echoing across the hills as he called Hylas' name with increasing urgency. His systematic exploration of every possible hiding place and his interrogation of the local inhabitants revealed nothing that could explain the mysterious vanishing. The other Argonauts initially assumed that Hylas had simply become lost while exploring the unfamiliar terrain, a reasonable explanation given the young man's tendency toward curiosity about new environments. However, as the search continued through the night and into the following day without discovering any trace of him, more sinister possibilities began to be considered. The local tribesmen spoke in whispers of the water nymph's reputation for claiming beautiful mortals, though they were reluctant to discuss such matters openly with foreign visitors. Heracles' refusal to abandon the search, even when Jason pointed out that the expedition's schedule could not accommodate indefinite delays, created the first serious crisis of leadership that the Argonauts had faced since their departure from Iolcus. The hero's emotional attachment to Hylas made him incapable of rational decision-making regarding the missing young man, while his legendary status made it impossible for other crew members to simply override his wishes through force. The situation required delicate handling to avoid permanently splitting the expedition. The resolution came through divine intervention rather than human negotiation, as a message from Zeus himself commanded Heracles to abandon his search and return to completing the labours that Eurystheus had assigned him. The god's communication took the form of an eagle that spoke with unmistakable divine authority, explaining that the hero's destiny lay along a different path than the one that would lead to Colchis and the Golden Fleece. This supernatural directive provided Heracles with a face-saving excuse for ending his futile search, while acknowledging that his presence was not essential for the expedition's ultimate success. The departure from Mysia without two of their most prominent members marked a turning point in the expedition's character, transforming it from a collection of individual heroes into a more cohesive unit under Jason's undisputed leadership. Heracles' absence removed a potential source of conflict regarding command decisions, while the loss of Hylas served as a sobering reminder that even the most capable individuals could fall victim to supernatural forces that operated beyond normal human understanding. The Argos' approach to Colchis came after navigating the treacherous currents where the Phasis River emptied into the eastern shores of the Black Sea, its muddy waters creating a brown stain that extended far into the darker ocean depths. The river mouth was guarded by massive stone towers that rose nearly 60 feet above the water level, their surfaces carved with protective symbols and equipped with bronze-tipped ballistae capable of sinking any vessel that attempted unauthorized passage. These fortifications represented the outer defenses of King Aeetes' realm, designed to demonstrate his power to visiting foreigners while providing practical protection against potential invaders. The city of Phasis spread along both banks of the river for several miles inland, its white limestone buildings rising in terraced levels from the waterfront toward the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. The architecture displayed influences from multiple civilizations, with Egyptian-style columns supporting Mesopotamian arches, while Greek decorative elements adorned facades that followed distinctly Colchian proportions. This eclectic combination reflected the kingdom's position as a crossroads of trade routes that connected the civilized world with the mysterious lands beyond the Black Sea's eastern shores. Merchant vessels from across the known world crowded the harbour facilities, their varied designs testifying to Colchis' importance as a commercial centre. Egyptian grain ships with their distinctive triangular sails lay anchored beside Phoenician trading galleys loaded with purple-dyed textiles, while smaller craft from the Greek city-states discharged cargoes of olive oil and wine. The air carried the mingled scents of exotic spices, cured leather, and the ever-present smell of fish that characterized all major ports. Though here these familiar odours were overlaid with the sharp, metallic tang that came from the region's extensive gold mining operations. The royal palace dominated the city's highest terrace, its massive walls constructed from blocks of black granite that had been quarried in the Caucasus Mountains and transported down the phases at enormous expense. The structure stretched nearly a quarter-mile from east to west, its multiple courtyards and towers creating a complex that housed not only the royal family, but also the extensive bureaucracy required to administer Aeetes' far-flung territories. The palace's most distinctive feature was a central tower that rose 200 feet above the surrounding buildings, its peak crowned with a bronze brazier that burned continuously as a beacon visible from great distances across the surrounding landscape. The walls surrounding this architectural marvel were decorated with relief carvings that depicted the history of Colchian royal power in scenes of startling violence and supernatural intervention. These stone narratives showed Aeetes' ancestors commanding dragons, summoning storms, and wielding magical artifacts against enemies both mortal and divine. The craftsmanship was exceptional, with individual figures carved in such detail that their facial expressions remained clearly visible from ground level, while the overall composition created a visual chronicle that served both artistic and political purposes. Guards stationed throughout the palace complex wore armour that reflected Aeetes' mastery of metallurgy, their bronze breastplates inlaid with gold in patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed from different angles. These warriors carried weapons forged using techniques that remained secret outside Colchis, their sword blades holding edges sharp enough to cut through ordinary bronze, while their spear points gleamed with an inner fire that suggested supernatural enhancement. Their disciplined formations and synchronized movements demonstrated training that surpassed that of conventional soldiers, marking them as an elite force worthy of protecting a king whose power derived from sources beyond mere political authority. The Argo's arrival at the harbour's main pier attracted immediate attention from port officials whose elaborate robes and ceremonial staffs identified them as representatives of royal authority rather than ordinary customs inspectors. These functionaries conducted their examination of the vessel and its crew with the thoroughness characteristic of a kingdom that had learned to be suspicious of foreign visitors, particularly those arriving in ships of obvious military potential. The inspection process revealed the officials' familiarity with Greek customs and language, suggesting that Colchis maintained extensive intelligence networks throughout the Mediterranean world. Jason's request for an audience with King Aeetes was received with the formal courtesy appropriate to his obvious noble status, though the delay imposed before any meeting could be arranged served notice that the Colchian court operated according to its own schedule rather than the convenience of foreign visitors. The waiting period stretched for 3 days, during which the Argonauts remained aboard their vessel under the watchful eyes of harbour guards, while palace messengers carried communications between various levels of the royal bureaucracy. This extended delay allowed Aeetes to gather detailed information about his visitors, while demonstrating that their arrival, however impressive their reputation, did not constitute an emergency requiring immediate royal attention. The formal audience took place in the palace's great hall, a chamber whose dimensions and decoration were calculated to overwhelm visitors with displays of wealth and power that exceeded anything found in the Greek world. The ceiling rose nearly 80 feet above a floor paved with alternating squares of white marble and black obsidian, their polished surfaces reflecting light from hundreds of oil lamps suspended from bronze chains. Massive columns carved from single blocks of red granite supported the roof structure, while providing surfaces for additional relief sculptures that depicted scenes of royal triumph over various enemies and supernatural adversaries. Aeetes himself occupied a throne constructed from materials that testified to his kingdom's exotic trade connections and supernatural resources. The seat was carved from a single block of amber large enough to accommodate his substantial frame, its golden surface containing perfectly preserved insects and plant fragments that had been trapped millions of years before human civilization began. The throne's armrests were fashioned from ivory tusks that could only have come from elephants far larger than any known to exist in the contemporary world, while its back was inlaid with gems that seemed to glow with their own inner light, rather than merely reflecting the illumination provided by the chamber's lamps. The king's physical appearance reflected his divine heritage as a son of Helios, his skin possessing a bronze coloration that seemed to emanate warmth even at a distance, while his eyes held the golden intensity of the sun itself. His hair, though showing the silver of advancing age, retained enough of its original black colour to create a striking contrast that emphasised rather than diminished his commanding presence. The royal robes he wore were woven from silk that had been dyed with pigments unknown outside Colchis, their deep purple colour shifting to crimson when the fabric moved, creating an effect that seemed to make the garments alive with internal fire. The court that surrounded Aeetes included advisors and nobles whose exotic appearance testified to the kingdom's position at the intersection of multiple civilizations. Scythian chieftains with their characteristic pointed caps and scale armour stood beside Egyptian priests whose shaved heads and white linen robes marked their religious authority, while Mesopotamian merchants in elaborately embroidered coats conversed quietly with local Colchian nobles whose clothing incorporated elements from all these foreign styles. This cosmopolitan assembly represented the various peoples who had been drawn to Colchis by its wealth and strategic importance, creating a court culture that was both sophisticated and fundamentally alien to Greek sensibilities. Jason's formal presentation of his request for the Golden Fleece was delivered with the diplomatic courtesy that Chiron had taught him, acknowledging Aeetes' authority while making clear his own royal status and the divine favour that supported his mission. The young hero's speech emphasised the honourable nature of his quest and his willingness to pay whatever price the king deemed appropriate for such a precious treasure, carefully avoiding any suggestion that he expected to receive the fleece as a gift or through conquest. His words were translated for those court members who did not understand Greek, though Aeetes himself demonstrated fluency in multiple languages as he questioned Jason about various aspects of his journey and ultimate intentions. The king's response revealed both his political cunning and his awareness of the supernatural forces that surrounded the Golden Fleece's presence in his kingdom. Rather than refusing Jason's request outright, which might have provoked the kind of violent confrontation that could damage his realm regardless of its outcome, Aeetes proposed a series of tasks that would theoretically allow the hero to earn the treasure through demonstrated worthiness. This approach preserved the king's reputation for fairness, while establishing conditions that he believed would prove impossible for any mortal to fulfill, effectively eliminating the threat Jason represented without resorting to open hostility. The first task involved yoking a pair of fire-breathing bulls that Hephaestus himself had crafted for Aeetes during the early years of his reign, when the god of the forge had sought the king's assistance in obtaining rare minerals found only in the Caucasus Mountains. These bronze creatures stood nearly twice the height of ordinary cattle, their metallic hides gleaming with the reddish colour of heated copper, while their eyes glowed like furnaces. The bull's breath emerged as jets of flame hot enough to melt bronze, while their hooves struck sparks from stone surfaces with sufficient force to shatter ordinary rock. Their supernatural strength exceeded that of any natural animal, making them capable of pulling ploughs through soil that would defeat teams of ordinary oxen. The second component of Aeetes' challenge required Jason to use these fire-breathing bulls to plough a field sacred to Ares, preparing the soil for the planting of dragon's teeth that the king would provide from his personal collection of magical artifacts. This particular field covered nearly 20 acres of ground that had been deliberately left uncultivated for decades, allowing it to become overgrown with thorny vegetation and studded with boulders that would challenge even supernatural agricultural equipment. The soil itself had been cursed by priests of Ares to resist normal cultivation methods, requiring the application of divine power to break its supernatural hardness. The dragon's teeth that Jason would be required to plant carried their own deadly properties, having been harvested from the same primordial serpent that Cadmus had slain during the founding of Thebes. When planted in properly prepared soil and watered with the blood of a hero, these teeth would sprout into fully armed warriors known as Spartoi, or sown men, who would emerge from the earth ready for battle. These supernatural soldiers possessed strength and skill that exceeded normal human capabilities, while their loyalty belonged entirely to whoever had planted the teeth that gave them life. The final element of the challenge required Jason to defeat the army of Spartoi that would spring from the planted dragon's teeth, a task that seemed impossible given that these warriors would number in the hundreds while possessing supernatural combat abilities. Previous attempts to complete similar challenges had resulted in the deaths of heroes whose reputations had been established through victories over monsters and gods, their bodies adding to the collection of bleached bones that decorated the sacred field of Ares as warnings to future challengers. Aeetes' presentation of these tasks was accompanied by detailed explanations of their requirements and the specific time constraints that would apply to their completion. The entire sequence had to be finished within a single day, from the yoking of the bulls at dawn to the defeat of the final Spartoi warrior before sunset. This limitation prevented Jason from developing elaborate strategies or seeking extensive assistance from his companions, while ensuring that any failure would be absolute and final rather than merely temporary. The king's secret intention was to ensure Jason's death regardless of his performance in the assigned tasks, a plan that reflected both his paranoid nature and his accurate assessment of the threat that the hero's success would pose to his continued rule. Even if Jason somehow managed to complete the impossible challenges, Aeetes had prepared additional obstacles that would prevent the Golden Fleece from leaving Colchis. The dragon that guarded the sacred grove had been instructed to kill anyone who approached the fleece, while the king's sorcerer's powers could create supernatural barriers that would trap Jason and his companions within the kingdom's borders. The revelation of these tasks created consternation among the Argonauts, who recognized that their leader was being asked to attempt something that exceeded the capabilities of any mortal hero. The fire-breathing bulls alone represented a challenge that would have tested Heracles at the height of his powers, while the requirement to defeat an army of supernatural warriors within a single day seemed designed to ensure failure. Several crew members urged Jason to abandon the quest and seek the Golden Fleece through alternative means, though the hero's honor and his awareness of divine expectations made such retreat impossible. The introduction of Medea into this increasingly desperate situation came through the intervention of Hera, who recognized that Jason would require supernatural assistance to overcome the challenges that Aeetes had designed to be impossible. The goddess arranged for Aphrodite to strike the young sorceress with an arrow of irresistible love, creating an emotional compulsion that would motivate her to betray her father's interests in favor of the foreign hero who had captured her heart. This divine manipulation represented a calculated intervention in mortal affairs that would have far-reaching consequences, extending far beyond the immediate question of the Golden Fleece's fate. Medea's first glimpse of Jason occurred during the formal audience where her father presented his impossible tasks, the young woman observing the proceedings from behind a screen that allowed royal women to witness court ceremonies without being seen by male visitors. Her initial impression focused on the hero's obvious nobility and physical attractiveness, qualities that distinguished him from the various foreign dignitaries and merchants who typically sought audiences with the king. However, it was Aphrodite's supernatural intervention that transformed casual interest into the consuming passion that would drive all her subsequent actions. The princess possessed magical abilities that had been developing since childhood, under the tutelage of her Aunt Circe, the renowned sorceress whose reputation for transforming men into beasts had spread throughout the known world. Medea's training had encompassed the preparation of potions that could heal wounds, induce sleep, or cause death, while her theoretical knowledge extended to spells that could command the elements and bind supernatural creatures to her will. Her youth and relative inexperience meant that her powers remained largely untested in practical situations, though her potential clearly exceeded that of most practitioners of the magical arts. The internal conflict between filial loyalty and supernatural compulsion that Aphrodite's arrow created in Medea's mind manifested as a series of sleepless nights during which she struggled to reconcile her duty to her father with her growing obsession with Jason's welfare. Her knowledge of the task's true impossibility made her aware that the hero faced certain death unless he received assistance that only her magical abilities could provide. While her understanding of Aetes's character convinced her that her father intended Jason's destruction, regardless of his performance in the assigned challenges, the resolution of Medea's internal struggle came through a carefully orchestrated, divine intervention that began with Hera's recognition that Jason's mission required supernatural assistance beyond what mortal courage and skill could provide. The Queen of the Gods had observed Aetes's impossible challenges with growing concern, understanding that the king's true intention was to eliminate Jason regardless of his performance in the assigned tasks. Hera's investment in the expedition's success stemmed from her desire to punish Peleus for his years of neglecting her worship, making Jason's survival essential to her broader plans for divine justice. The goddess's solution involved enlisting Aphrodite's cooperation in a scheme that would exploit the one weakness in Aetes's seemingly impregnable defences, his daughter's untested but formidable magical abilities. Hera understood that Medea possessed the knowledge and power necessary to neutralize her father's supernatural challenges, but the young sorceress's filial loyalty would normally prevent her from betraying the king's interests. Only the overwhelming compulsion of divine love could override such deeply ingrained obligations, making Aphrodite's intervention crucial to the plan's success. Aphrodite's initial reluctance to participate in Hera's scheme reflected the goddess of love's preference for romantic entanglements that developed naturally rather than through supernatural coercion. The younger goddess took pride in her ability to inspire genuine passion between mortals, viewing forced attractions as inferior substitutes for the authentic emotions that made love truly powerful. However, Hera's arguments about the justice of Jason's cause and the importance of preventing Aetes's tyrannical behaviour eventually convinced Aphrodite to lend her assistance to the enterprise. The method chosen for inducing Medea's infatuation involved Eros, Aphrodite's son, whose arrows carried the power to inspire irresistible love in any mortal they struck. The young god's appearance belied his tremendous influence over human affairs, his childlike features and mischievous demeanour concealing abilities that could reshape entire kingdoms through the romantic obsessions he created. His golden arrows inspired passionate love, while his lead-tipped shafts produced equally powerful aversion, giving him the ability to manipulate mortal emotions with surgical precision. Eros's assignment required him to strike Medea with one of his golden arrows at the precise moment when her eyes first fell upon Jason, ensuring that the hero's image would become permanently associated with the supernatural compulsion that would drive her subsequent actions. The timing was crucial, as the arrow's effect would be strongest when the target was already in a heightened emotional state, making Medea's presence at her father's court during Jason's audience an ideal opportunity for the divine intervention. The young god positioned himself invisibly in the palace's great hall, his supernatural nature allowing him to observe the proceedings without detection by any of the mortals present. His bow, crafted from materials that existed only in the divine realm, could fire arrows that travelled faster than mortal sight could follow, while penetrating any physical or magical defences that might protect their intended targets. The weapon's power derived from Aphrodite herself, making its effects impossible to resist through normal human willpower. The moment of impact came as Medea caught her first clear glimpse of Jason through the decorative screen that concealed the royal women's viewing area. Eros's arrow struck her heart with the force of a lightning bolt, its golden tip carrying divine compulsion that immediately overwhelmed her conscious mind with an obsession so powerful that her previous concerns and loyalties seemed to evaporate like morning mist. The physical sensation was both painful and ecstatic, as if her entire nervous system had been set ablaze with emotions too intense for mortal flesh to contain comfortably. The immediate effects of the arrow's strike manifested in physical symptoms that Medea struggled to conceal from the other women sharing her concealed vantage point. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, her breathing became rapid and shallow, and her skin flushed with a heat that seemed to emanate from within rather than from the chamber's oil lamps. Most disturbing was the way her vision seemed to focus exclusively on Jason's figure, as if the rest of the great hall had faded into insignificance while the hero alone remained brilliantly illuminated. Medea's magical training had included instruction in recognizing supernatural influences, but the overwhelming nature of her emotional response made rational analysis impossible. The young sorceress found herself unable to concentrate on anything except Jason's appearance, her mind cataloguing every detail of his bearing, expression and movement with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His voice, when he spoke to her father, seemed to carry musical qualities that resonated through her entire being, while his gestures appeared to possess a grace that elevated them beyond mere human movement. The princess's knowledge of her father's true intentions regarding the impossible tasks created an additional layer of anguish that complicated her supernatural infatuation. Her understanding of Etis's character made her certain that Jason would die regardless of his performance in the assigned challenges, while her growing magical expertise allowed her to recognize the specific ways in which the fire-breathing bulls and dragon's teeth had been designed to ensure the hero's destruction. The conflict between her desire to save Jason and her lifelong conditioning to obey her father's will created a psychological tension that threatened to tear her mind apart. The sleepless nights that followed Jason's audience were filled with internal debates that raged back and forth as Medea struggled to reconcile her supernatural compulsion with her rational understanding of the situation's implications. Her chambers in the palace's women's quarters became a prison where she paced endlessly, her mind churning through possibilities and consequences, while her heart demanded action that her upbringing told her was unthinkable. The young woman's servants noticed her distress, but attributed it to concern about the political implications of the foreign hero's presence, rather than personal emotional turmoil. Medea's magical abilities, which had previously been a source of pride and intellectual satisfaction, now became instruments of torture as her enhanced perception allowed her to sense Jason's presence throughout the palace complex. Her supernatural awareness could detect his location, emotional state, and even his dreams during the hours when exhaustion finally claimed him. This constant connection to the object of her obsession made it impossible for her to find relief through distraction or sleep, intensifying her suffering while making the need for resolution increasingly urgent. The decision to approach Jason directly came after 3 days of psychological torment that had left Medea gaunt and hollow-eyed despite her efforts to maintain a normal appearance. Her magical training had taught her to recognize when supernatural forces were influencing mortal affairs, and she'd finally acknowledged that her feelings for the foreign hero exceeded anything that natural attraction could produce. This understanding, rather than providing relief, only intensified her determination to act on emotions that she now recognized as divinely inspired. The clandestine meeting was arranged through Chalciope, Medea's older sister, whose own sons had sailed with Jason's crew and who possessed both the motivation and the access necessary to facilitate a secret encounter. Chalciope had married Phrixus during his exile in Colchis, bearing him 4 sons who had inherited their grandfather's divine heritage, along with their father's noble character. These young men had joined the Argonauts during the expedition's journey eastward, their knowledge of Colchian customs and their family connections making them valuable additions to Jason's crew. Calcioppe's involvement in her sister's romantic crisis reflected both sisterly concern and political calculation, as she understood that Jason's success or failure would directly affect her own son's welfare. If the hero died during Aetes' impossible tasks, her children would likely face execution as potential threats to the king's authority, their connection to the failed expedition making them convenient scapegoats for their grandfather's paranoia. Conversely, if Jason somehow succeeded in obtaining the Golden Fleece, Calcioppe's family might benefit from association with his victory. The meeting location chosen for this crucial encounter was a secluded grove sacred to Hecate, the goddess of magic and crossroads, whose worship held particular significance for practitioners of the supernatural arts. The site lay approximately 2 miles from the palace, accessible through a network of paths that wound through dense forest, where the chances of discovery by palace guards or curious servants remained minimal. The grove itself contained an ancient altar where Medea had conducted many of her magical experiments, making it familiar territory where she could feel confident about maintaining the secrecy essential to their discussion. The timing of the rendezvous was carefully calculated to coincide with the darkest phase of the night, when most of the palace's inhabitants would be deep in sleep, while the reduced guard presence made clandestine movement through the grounds more feasible. Medea's knowledge of the palace's security routines, gained through years of nocturnal magical practice, allowed her to identify windows of opportunity when the various checkpoints and patrol routes could be navigated without detection. Her magical abilities provided additional insurance against discovery, as she could cast minor illusions that would make her presence less noticeable to the casual observation. Jason's willingness to participate in such a dangerous meeting reflected both his desperate need for assistance and his growing awareness that conventional approaches to Aetes' challenges would prove inadequate. The hero's assessment of the fire-breathing bulls and dragon's teeth had convinced him that mortal strength and skill, however exceptional, could not overcome supernatural obstacles that had been specifically designed to exceed human capabilities. His conversations with the expedition's seers had confirmed that divine intervention would be necessary, though the specific form such assistance might take remained unclear until Calciope approached him with her sister's proposal. The Grove of Hecate presented an appropriately mysterious setting for negotiations that would determine the fate of both participants and potentially reshape the political landscape of the entire region. Ancient oak trees formed a natural amphitheatre around the goddess's altar, their massive trunks creating barriers that would muffle sound, while their interwoven branches filtered moonlight into patterns that seemed to shift and dance with supernatural significance. The air carried the scent of herbs that grew wild in sacred spaces, their aromatic properties believed to enhance magical workings while protecting practitioners from hostile supernatural influences. Medea's appearance at the appointed meeting demonstrated the toll that her supernatural obsession had taken on her physical condition during the preceding days of internal struggle. Her normally lustrous black hair hung loose around her shoulders, rather than being arranged in the elaborate styles favoured by Colchian royalty, while her pale skin seemed almost translucent in the filtered moonlight. The simple white robe she wore was appropriate for magical workings, but starkly different from the rich fabrics and complex jewellery that usually marked her royal status, creating an impression of vulnerability that contrasted sharply with her reputation for supernatural power. The young sorceress's first words to Jason reveal the depth of her emotional turmoil, while establishing the practical basis for their potential collaboration. She acknowledged her awareness of her father's true intentions regarding the impossible tasks, explaining that Aetes had designed the challenges to ensure Jason's death regardless of his performance. Her knowledge of the specific supernatural properties of the fire-breathing bulls and dragon's teeth provided crucial intelligence that no amount of conventional reconnaissance could have obtained, while her understanding of the sacred field's cursed nature revealed additional obstacles that the hero would need to overcome. Jason's response demonstrated the diplomatic skills that Chiron had emphasized throughout his education, as he acknowledged both Medea's valuable assistance and the tremendous personal risk she was accepting by betraying her father's plans. The hero's recognition of her sacrifice was genuine rather than calculated, reflecting his understanding that her decision to help him would likely result in permanent exile from her homeland and family. His willingness to accept such a costly gift created the foundation for a relationship that would extend far beyond the immediate crisis they faced. The magical assistance that Medea offered took the form of a protective ointment, whose preparation would require ingredients that could only be obtained through her privileged access to the palace's extensive collection of supernatural materials. The formula had been developed by her Aunt Circe during the early years of the sorceress's career, its effectiveness proven through successful application in situations where mortals needed protection from divine or supernatural threats. The ointment's primary component was the blood of Prometheus, the Titan who had stolen fire from the gods and whose suffering had imbued his vital essence with properties that could resist even divine flames. The process of creating this protective compound required not only rare ingredients, but also magical techniques that demanded years of training to master safely. Medea would need to conduct the preparation during the hours immediately before Jason's attempt to complete Aeetes' tasks, ensuring that the ointment retained maximum potency when applied to his skin and equipment. The timing was crucial, as the protective properties would begin to fade within hours of the compound's creation, making advanced preparation impossible. Additional magical assistance would come through Medea's knowledge of specific techniques for managing the supernatural warriors that would spring from the planted dragon's teeth. Her studies had revealed that the Spartoi, despite their formidable combat abilities, possessed a crucial weakness that could be exploited by anyone with sufficient understanding of their magical nature. These earthborn warriors were compelled to attack the first target they encountered upon emerging from the soil, but their primitive intelligence made them susceptible to confusion tactics that could redirect their aggression toward each other rather than their intended victim. The price that Medea demanded for her assistance was marriage to Jason and passage aboard the Argo when the expedition departed Colchis, terms that reflected both her supernatural compulsion and her practical understanding of the consequences her betrayal would bring. The young sorceress recognized that helping Jason would make her position in Colchis untenable, regardless of the hero's ultimate success or failure, as Aeetes would never forgive what he would view as the ultimate act of filial treachery. Her only hope for survival lay in permanent exile, while her obsession with Jason made the prospect of separation from him literally unbearable. Jason's acceptance of these terms was immediate and unequivocal, reflecting both his desperate need for supernatural assistance and his genuine appreciation for the magnitude of Medea's sacrifice. The hero understood that he was accepting responsibility for a young woman whose magical abilities made her potentially dangerous, while her royal status created political complications that could affect his relationships with other kingdoms. However, his honor demanded that he protect someone who was risking everything to ensure his survival, while his practical intelligence recognized the value of having a powerful sorceress as a permanent ally. The oath that sealed their agreement was sworn by the sacred waters of the river Styx, invoking divine witness to promises that could not be broken without incurring the wrath of the gods themselves. This binding ceremony transformed their arrangement from a temporary alliance into a permanent commitment that would survive whatever trials lay ahead, while providing Medea with the assurance she needed to proceed with her dangerous plan. The magical resonance of the oath created a connection between them that transcended normal human relationships, linking their fates in ways that neither fully understood at the time. The specific instructions that Medea provided for Jason's use of the protective ointment revealed the depth of her magical knowledge, while demonstrating her understanding of the practical challenges he would face during his attempt to complete the impossible tasks. The compound would need to be applied not only to his skin, but also to his weapons, armor, and clothing, creating a comprehensive barrier against the supernatural flames that the bronze bulls would direct against him. The application process required specific incantations that would activate the ointment's protective properties, while the timing of these magical words was crucial to ensuring maximum effectiveness. The dawn of the appointed day broke with an ominous stillness that seemed to muffle even the usual sounds of the awakening city, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation of the supernatural trials about to unfold. Jason rose before the first light touched the eastern mountains, his body moving with the controlled precision of someone who'd spent the night in careful preparation rather than restful sleep. The protective ointment that Medea had provided lay in a bronze vessel beside his sleeping couch, its surface gleaming with an oily iridescence that seemed to shift between gold and silver as the lamplight played across its contents. The compound's preparation had required Medea to work through the darkest hours of the night, her hands moving with practiced precision as she combined ingredients that would have been impossible for anyone else to obtain. The blood of Prometheus formed the base, a crimson liquid that retained the warmth of divine fire even after centuries of separation from its immortal source. To this she had added powdered horn from the golden ram itself, obtained from fragments that had fallen during Phrixus's sacrifice years earlier and carefully preserved in the palace's magical repositories. Herbs gathered at specific phases of the moon provided additional protection, while words of power spoken in the ancient language of Colchian sorcery bound the mixture into a unified whole. The application process demanded meticulous attention to detail, as any area left unprotected would provide an opening for the supernatural flames that the bronze bulls would unleash. Jason began with his skin, working the ointment into every inch of exposed flesh, with movements that followed the specific patterns Medea had demonstrated during their clandestine meeting. The compound felt cool against his skin initially, but as the magical words of activation were spoken, it began to generate a gentle warmth that seemed to penetrate deep into his muscles and bones. The sensation was not unpleasant, rather like being warmed by sunlight filtered through clear water. His weapons and armour required equally careful treatment, each piece receiving a thorough coating that would protect against both supernatural fire and the physical impact of the bronze bull's massive strength. The sword that Chiron had given him gleamed with new lustre as the ointment soaked into its bronze blade, while his spear point seemed to glow with inner light that suggested the protective compound had awakened dormant properties within the metal itself. His shield, crafted from 7 layers of oxhide reinforced with bronze bands, absorbed the magical preparation like a thirsty plant drinking water, its surface taking on a mirror-like quality that would deflect both flame and physical assault. The sacred field of Ares lay approximately 3 miles from the palace, accessible through a road that had been constructed specifically for the transportation of the supernatural bulls when they were needed for the king's periodic demonstrations of divine favour. The route passed through increasingly desolate terrain as it approached the cursed ground, with normal vegetation giving way to twisted shrubs and stunted trees that bore the marks of supernatural blight. The soil itself changed colour from the rich brown of fertile earth to an ominous red-black that suggested blood had been spilled here in quantities sufficient to permanently stain the landscape. The field itself stretched across 20 acres of ground that had been deliberately maintained in a state of supernatural hostility to normal cultivation. Massive boulders, some weighing several tons, dotted the surface at irregular intervals, their placement seeming random but actually following patterns that enhanced the cursed nature of the soil beneath. Thorny vines with stems thick as a man's arm twisted between these stone obstacles, their barbed surfaces gleaming with a moisture that was not dew but something far more sinister. The air above the field shimmered with heat that rose from the ground despite the early morning coolness, creating distortions that made accurate distance estimation difficult. At the field's eastern edge stood a bronze enclosure that housed Eetes's fire-breathing bulls, its walls rising 15 feet above the ground and reinforced with magical symbols that glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. The structure's gates were secured with chains forged from the same supernatural bronze as the bulls themselves, their links so massive that ordinary human strength could never have moved them. The sounds emerging from within the enclosure suggested creatures of enormous size moving restlessly in anticipation of their release, their hooves striking the bronze floor with impacts that sent vibrations through the ground for hundreds of yards in all directions. King Aeetes arrived at the field accompanied by his full court, their colourful robes and elaborate jewellery creating a stark contrast to the desolate landscape surrounding the cursed ground. The royal viewing platform had been constructed on a low hill that provided an excellent vantage point while maintaining safe distance from the supernatural forces about to be unleashed. Bronze braziers burned at regular intervals around the platform's perimeter, their flames fed by oils that produced smoke in patterns that the court's seers would interpret for omens regarding the trial's outcome. The king's confidence in his impossible task's effectiveness was evident in his relaxed demeanour as he settled into his throne-like chair to observe Jason's inevitable destruction. Aeetes had witnessed previous attempts to complete similar challenges, watching with satisfaction as heroes whose reputations had been earned through victories over monsters and gods were reduced to ash and bone by his supernatural guardians. The bronze bulls had never failed to eliminate anyone foolish enough to attempt their yoking, while the dragon's teeth had produced armies of earthborn warriors that had overwhelmed even the most skilled military tacticians. Medea's presence among the court observers created an additional source of tension that only she and Jason fully understood, as her outward appearance of calm interest concealed the desperate anxiety she felt about the protective measures they had implemented. The young sorceress had never before attempted magic of such complexity and importance, while her knowledge of the bull's capabilities made her acutely aware of the numerous ways in which their plan could fail catastrophically. Her hands remained steady as she maintained the royal composure expected of a princess, but her eyes never left Jason's figure as he approached the bronze enclosure containing his supernatural adversaries. The release mechanism for the bull's prison had been designed to operate from a safe distance, employing a system of bronze levers and counterweights that could open the massive gates without requiring anyone to approach within range of the creature's deadly breath. Aeetes himself operated this device, his movements deliberate and ceremonial as he prepared to unleash forces that had been crafted by Hephaestus himself during the early years of his reign. The mechanical precision of the system reflected Colchian engineering expertise that rivaled anything found in the Greek world, while its supernatural components elevated it beyond mere mortal craftsmanship. The gates swung open with a grinding of bronze against bronze that seemed to echo across the entire landscape, followed immediately by the emergence of creatures that defied natural law in every aspect of their existence. The fire-breathing bulls stood nearly 8 feet tall at the shoulder, their bodies constructed from bronze that had been alloyed with materials that existed only in divine forges. Their hides gleamed with the reddish colour of heated metal, while their eyes burned with the same fires that raged within their supernatural hearts. Steam rose from their nostrils even when they were not actively breathing flame, while their hooves left molten footprints in the stone floor of their enclosure. The bull's first sight of Jason triggered an immediate aggressive response that demonstrated both their supernatural intelligence and their programmed hostility toward any mortal who dared approach them. Their heads lowered in unison, massive horns gleaming like polished spear points as they prepared to charge the lone figure standing between them and freedom. The sound that emerged from their throats was unlike anything produced by natural animals, a roaring that combined the bellow of enraged cattle with the crackling of enormous fires. The ground trembled beneath their weight as they pawed the earth, their bronze hooves striking sparks that ignited the dry grass around their feet. Jason's approach to these supernatural guardians required every ounce of courage and tactical thinking that Chiron's training had developed in him over nearly 2 decades of preparation. The protective ointment that covered his skin and equipment provided essential defense against their fiery breath, but it could not eliminate the physical danger posed by creatures whose strength exceeded that of any natural animal. His strategy involved using their aggressive nature against them, allowing their initial charge to carry them past his position, while he moved to attack from angles that their bulk and momentum would make difficult to defend. The first bull's charge came with the force of a landslide, its massive frame accelerating from standstill to full speed in a distance that seemed impossibly short. The creature's breath preceded it like a wave of molten air, the supernatural flames reaching temperatures that would have instantly incinerated any unprotected mortal. Jason's dive to the side required split-second timing, his body rolling across the rough ground as the bull thundered past, its bronze hooves missing his head by mere inches. The heat from its passage was so intense that the stones where he had been standing cracked audibly, while the grass burst into flame that spread in all directions. The second bull's attack followed immediately, its trajectory calculated to intercept Jason's evasive movement and trap him between the two creatures' combined assault. The coordination between the supernatural animals suggested intelligence that exceeded normal bovine capabilities, their tactical thinking apparently enhanced by the same divine craftsmanship that had created their bronze bodies. Jason's response required him to use his spear as a vaulting pole, launching himself over the second bull's lowered head while its fiery breath scorched the ground beneath him. The landing brought Jason within arm's reach of the first bull's massive neck, providing the opportunity he needed to attempt the yoking that represented the trial's primary objective. The bronze yoke that would harness the creatures lay nearby, its weight and dimensions calculated for supernatural rather than natural animals. The device was constructed from the same divine bronze as the bulls themselves, its surface inscribed with binding symbols that would compel obedience once properly attached to the creatures' necks. However, the attachment process required Jason to maintain physical contact with animals whose every movement could prove lethal. The protective ointment's effectiveness became apparent as Jason grasped the first bull's bronze neck, his hands maintaining their grip despite the creature's frantic efforts to dislodge him through violent bucking and twisting movements. The supernatural flames that erupted around him created a visual spectacle that drew gasps of amazement from the watching court, as the hero appeared to be wreathed in fire while continuing his efforts to secure the yoke. The magical protection prevented the flames from burning his skin or clothing, though the heat was still sufficient to make breathing difficult and vision uncertain. The yoking process required Jason to work with methodical precision, despite the chaos of the bull's continued resistance, his movements following the specific techniques that Medea had described during their secret meeting. The bronze yoke had to be positioned exactly across both creatures' necks simultaneously, its weight distribution calculated to prevent either bull from breaking free through individual effort. The binding symbols inscribed on its surface would only activate when the device was properly secured, making partial attachment useless for controlling the supernatural animals. The moment when the yoke finally clicked into its locked position marked a dramatic transformation in the bull's behaviour, their violent resistance ceasing as if a switch had been thrown in their bronze minds. The binding magic that Hephaestus had incorporated into the yoke's design asserted control over the creature's actions, though their fiery nature remained unchanged. Steam continued to rise from their bronze hides, while their eyes still glowed with supernatural fire, but their movements now responded to Jason's guidance rather than their own aggressive instincts. The sacred field's preparation for ploughing required Jason to guide his supernatural team across terrain that had been deliberately designed to resist normal agricultural methods. The cursed soil had developed a consistency somewhere between stone and metal, requiring the bull's supernatural strength to break through its surface, while their fiery breath helped to burn away the thorny vegetation that had grown unchecked for decades. The bronze plough that would prepare the ground for the dragon's teeth was proportioned for the bull's massive strength. its share designed to cut furrows deep enough to accommodate the magical seeds that would soon be planted. The ploughing itself proceeded with mechanical efficiency once Jason had mastered the technique of directing the fire-breathing bulls through their bronze yoke, though the work was far more physically demanding than any normal agricultural activity. The supernatural creature's strength was so great that controlling their movement required constant attention and considerable physical effort, while the heat they generated made the work exhausting despite the protective ointment's defensive properties. The furrows they created were perfectly straight and uniform in depth, their precision reflecting the divine craftsmanship that had created both the bulls and their bronze plough. The dragon's teeth that Aetes provided for the trial's second phase were contained in a leather pouch that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, as if the ancient bone fragments retained some connection to the primordial serpent from which they had been harvested. Each tooth was approximately 6 inches long and curved like a sabre, its surface marked with patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed directly. The magical properties that would transform these bone fragments into living warriors were activated by contact with properly prepared soil and the blood of a hero, making the planting process as dangerous as the combat that would follow. The planting technique required Jason to create individual holes for each dragon's tooth, their spacing calculated according to formulas that Medea had memorized from her magical studies. The teeth had to be buried point down at specific depths, while drops of Jason's blood provided the vital essence necessary to trigger their supernatural germination. The hero used his sword to create small cuts on his forearm, allowing his blood to drip onto each planted tooth before covering it with the cursed soil that the bronze bulls had prepared. The transformation of the planted teeth into living warriors began immediately after the final seed was covered, the ground above each burial site beginning to heave and crack as supernatural forces animated the bone fragments beneath. The process resembled a grotesque parody of normal plant growth, with armoured limbs emerging from the soil like metallic shoots seeking sunlight. The Spartoi that pulled themselves from the earth were fully formed warriors from the moment of their birth, their bronze armour gleaming with the same supernatural properties as the bull's hides, while their weapons appeared in their hands as if conjured from the air itself. The Earthborn army that faced Jason numbered nearly 200 warriors, each standing over 7 feet tall and possessing strength that exceeded normal human capabilities by a significant margin. Their faces, visible through the eye slits of their bronze helmets, showed no expression of human intelligence or emotion, only the blank determination of creatures created for a single purpose. Their weapons included swords, spears, and shields that had been forged from the same supernatural bronze as their armour, while their movements displayed the coordinated precision of veteran soldiers, despite having existed for only minutes. Jason's strategy for defeating this supernatural army relied on the crucial weakness that Medea had revealed during their clandestine meeting, a flaw in their magical nature that could be exploited by anyone with sufficient understanding of their creation. The Spartoi were compelled to attack the first target they encountered upon emerging from the soil, but their primitive intelligence made them incapable of distinguishing between different types of enemies. A stone thrown into their midst would redirect their attention toward each other, transforming an organized army into a chaotic melee that would ultimately result in their mutual destruction. The implementation of this strategy required precise timing and careful positioning, as Jason needed to remain close enough to throw his stone accurately while staying far enough away to avoid being caught in the resulting battle. The hero selected a fist-sized rock from the field's abundant supply of debris, its weight and shape suitable for the long throw that would carry it into the centre of the Spartoi formation. His aim had to be perfect, as a stone that fell short would fail to trigger the desired confusion, while one that overshot might alert the warriors to his presence before their fratricidal combat could begin. The stone's impact among the Earthborn warriors created exactly the confusion that Medea's knowledge had predicted. the supernatural soldiers immediately turning on each other with the same mindless aggression they had been prepared to direct against Jason. Their bronze weapons rang against bronze armour in a cacophony that echoed across the sacred field, while their superhuman strength made each blow potentially lethal. The battle that ensued was unlike anything witnessed in normal human warfare, as the Spartoi fought with mechanical precision and supernatural endurance that allowed the combat to continue far longer than any mortal conflict could have sustained. The systematic destruction of the Earthborn army proceeded with inexorable efficiency, as the warriors eliminated each other through the very qualities that made them formidable opponents. Their inability to feel pain or fatigue meant that wounded Spartoi continued fighting until their injuries became physically incapacitating, while their supernatural strength ensured that successful attacks caused devastating damage. The bronze weapons that had been conjured with their bodies proved capable of penetrating their supernatural armour, creating wounds that spurted a golden ichor rather than normal blood. King Aeetes' reaction to Jason's success in completing both phases of the impossible trial was a mixture of rage, disbelief, and growing paranoia about the supernatural forces that must have assisted the foreign hero. The king's understanding of his fire-breathing bull's capabilities made Jason's survival of their flames seem impossible without magical intervention, while his knowledge of the dragon's teeth's properties made the defeat of the resulting army equally inexplicable through normal means. The only logical explanation was that someone with access to powerful sorcery had provided assistance, and the king's suspicions immediately focused on his own daughter. The public nature of Jason's triumph made it impossible for Aeetes to simply ignore the hero's success, or claim that the tasks had not been completed according to their original specifications. The assembled court had witnessed every phase of the trial, while representatives from various allied kingdoms could testify to the supernatural nature of the challenges and the completeness of Jason's victory. Any attempt to renege on the promised reward would damage the king's reputation for fairness, while potentially provoking the kind of international incident that could threaten Colchis' diplomatic relationships. However, Aeetes had no intention of actually surrendering the Golden Fleece, regardless of Jason's performance in the assigned tasks, his original plan having always included additional obstacles that would prevent the treasure from leaving his kingdom. The king's announcement that Jason would be granted access to the sacred grove where the fleece hung was carefully worded to avoid any promise of safe passage or protection from the supernatural guardians that protected the treasure. The dragon that never slept remained as the final barrier between the hero and his ultimate objective, a creature whose power exceeded even that of the fire-breathing bulls. The king's secret preparations for eliminating Jason and his companions involved mobilizing the palace guard and positioning troops at strategic locations throughout the city, their orders being to prevent any foreign vessel from leaving Colchian waters. These military arrangements were disguised as routine security measures related to the day's extraordinary events, but their true purpose was to ensure that the Argonauts would be trapped within the kingdom, regardless of whether Jason succeeded in obtaining the Golden Fleece. Aeetes intended to claim that the heroes had attempted to steal additional treasures beyond their agreed prize, providing justification for their arrest and execution. Medea's observation of her father's preparations confirmed her worst fears about his intentions, while validating her decision to assist Jason despite the personal costs involved. The young sorceress understood that Aeetes would never allow the Golden Fleece to leave Colchis voluntarily, making her continued cooperation essential for the expedition's survival. Her magical abilities would be crucial for overcoming the dragon that guarded the sacred grove, while her knowledge of the palace's defences could provide the intelligence necessary for the Argonauts to escape the trap that was closing around them. The sacred grove of Ares lay hidden in the deepest recesses of the royal forest, approximately 5 miles from the palace through paths that wound between ancient trees whose trunks bore the scars of centuries. The journey to this hallowed ground required navigation through terrain that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors with thorny undergrowth blocking obvious routes, while hidden streams created treacherous footing for the unwary. The very air grew thicker as one approached the grove, carrying scents of exotic flowers that bloom nowhere else in Colchis, alongside the metallic tang that always accompanied places where divine power had taken permanent residence. The great oak that dominated the grove's centre stood nearly 200 feet tall, its massive trunk requiring 40 men holding hands to encircle its circumference. The tree's age exceeded human memory, its gnarled bark bearing patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering light of the torches that burned continuously around the grove's perimeter. These flames were fed by oils that never required replenishment, their supernatural nature ensuring that the sacred space remained illuminated, regardless of weather conditions or the passage of time. The light they cast created dancing shadows that gave the impression of constant movement throughout the grove, even when no wind stirred the ancient branches. From the oak's central branch hung the golden fleece, suspended by bronze hooks that had been blessed by priests of Ares and inscribed with protective runes designed to prevent theft or desecration. The fleece itself seemed to generate its own illumination, each golden strand catching and amplifying the torchlight until the entire treasure appeared to glow with inner fire. The supernatural radiance extended for nearly 50 yards in all directions, creating a circle of golden light that made concealment impossible for anyone attempting to approach the sacred tree. The fleece's weight caused the massive branch to bow slightly, though the divine nature of both the treasure and its support ensured that no natural force could break their connection. Coiled around the oak's base lay the sleepless dragon, a creature whose supernatural origins traced back to the primordial chaos that had existed before the gods established order in the natural world. The beast's length exceeded 100 feet from its wedge-shaped head to the tip of its barbed tail, while its body was thick enough that a man could not wrap his arms around its smallest section. The dragon's scales gleamed like polished obsidian, their surface reflecting the golden light of the fleece in patterns that seemed to hypnotize anyone who stared too long. Each scale was the size of a warrior's shield, overlapping in arrangements that provided protection superior to any armor crafted by mortal hands. The creature's eyes never closed, their golden irises containing pupils that dilated and contracted according to patterns that followed no earthly rhythm. These orbs burned with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien, reflecting awareness that encompassed not only the immediate grove, but also events occurring throughout the surrounding forest. The dragon's supernatural perception allowed it to detect approaching threats from distances that exceeded normal sensory capabilities, while its divine nature made it immune to conventional weapons and most forms of magical attack. Its breath carried the scent of sulphur and ancient earth, while the sound of its movement created vibrations that could be felt through the ground for hundreds of yards in all directions. Medea's preparations for the midnight assault on the sacred grove required her to draw upon magical knowledge that pushed the boundaries of her training while risking detection by palace guards who had been ordered to monitor all unusual activities. The young sorceress worked in her private chambers during the hours after Jason's triumph in the field of Ares, her hands moving with practiced precision as she combined ingredients that would create the most potent sleeping draught her skills could produce. The formula required components that existed nowhere outside Colchis, their supernatural properties making them essential for any magic intended to affect creatures of divine origin. The primary ingredient was extracted from the root of a plant that grew only in soil watered by the blood of titans, its narcotic properties so powerful that even minute quantities could induce unconsciousness in mortal beings. To this Medea added powdered horn from a unicorn that had died of old age rather than violence, the peaceful nature of its death being crucial for magic intended to bring sleep rather than harm. Drops of water from the river Lethe provided the forgetfulness that would prevent the dragon from remembering the circumstances of its slumber, while words of power spoken in the ancient language of Colchian sorcery bound the mixture into a unified whole. the preparation process required Medea to maintain absolute concentration, while speaking incantations that had been passed down through generations of Colchian sorceresses, their syllables carrying meanings that existed only in the realm of supernatural forces. Each word had to be pronounced with perfect accuracy, as even minor variations could transform beneficial magic into deadly curses that would destroy both the practitioner and her intended target. The young woman's voice remained steady despite the enormous pressure she felt, her training under Circe having taught her to compartmentalize fear and doubt during the execution of complex magical workings. The timing of their departure from the palace required careful coordination with the guard rotations that Medea had observed during her years of nocturnal magical practice. The changing of the watch occurred at midnight, creating a brief window when the sentry's attention would be focused on their own movements rather than potential intruders. The route she'd selected avoided the main pathways where guards maintained regular patrols, instead following servants' corridors and maintenance passages that provided access to the palace's outer walls without encountering official checkpoints. Jason's preparation for the night's work involved more than simply gathering weapons and equipment, as the supernatural nature of their target required mental and spiritual readiness that exceeded the demands of normal combat. The hero spent the evening hours in meditation techniques that Chiron had taught him for maintaining focus during encounters with divine or magical opponents, his breathing controlled and his mind cleared of distracting thoughts about potential consequences. The protective ointment that had served him so well during the day's trials retained enough potency to provide some defense against the dragon's supernatural abilities, though its effectiveness would be significantly reduced by the time they reached the sacred grove. The weapons Jason selected for the night's work reflected his understanding that conventional arms would prove useless against a creature of the dragon's supernatural nature, while Medea's magic would provide their primary means of achieving success. His sword remained at his side more for psychological comfort than practical utility, while his spear could serve as a climbing aid if they needed to reach the fleece's elevated position. The bronze grappling hooks and rope that he carried were intended for the actual theft rather than combat, their mundane nature making them less likely to trigger the magical defences that protected the sacred grove. Their departure from the palace occurred during the darkest hour before dawn, when the moon had set but the eastern sky showed no hint of approaching daylight. Medea led the way through passages that she'd used for years without detection, her intimate knowledge of the palace's layout allowing them to avoid areas where their presence might be noticed by servants or guards. The young sorceress moved with the silent grace of someone trained in supernatural arts, her footsteps making no sound even on stone floors while her breathing remained controlled despite the tension that filled her entire body. The forest paths that led to the sacred grove presented different challenges than the palace corridors, with natural obstacles that required careful navigation in near-total darkness. Medea's magical training included techniques for enhancing night vision that allowed her to guide their progress without the torches that would have announced their approach to any watchers. The supernatural awareness that came with her sorceress abilities provided additional guidance, as she could sense the grove's location through the emanations of divine power that surrounded the golden fleece and its guardian dragon. The first indication of their proximity to the sacred grove came through changes in the forest's natural sounds, as normal nocturnal creatures fell silent when they entered the area, affected by the dragon's supernatural presence. The absence of insect chirping and small animal movement created an unnatural quiet that seemed to muffle even their own carefully controlled breathing, while the air itself grew heavier with each step they took toward their destination. The scent of exotic flowers became stronger as they approached, though it was now mixed with the sulphurous odour that marked the dragon's territory. The grove's perimeter was marked by a circle of standing stones that predated human settlement in the region, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the uncertain light of the eternal torches. These megalithic sentinels stood 12 feet tall and were spaced at intervals that created natural gateways between them, though each opening was protected by magical barriers that would alert the dragon to any unauthorized intrusion. Medea's knowledge of the protective spells allowed her to identify the single entrance that could be safely traversed during the brief period when the moon's influence weakened the guardian enchantments. The sight of the dragon itself was more overwhelming than either Jason or Medea had anticipated, despite their theoretical knowledge of the creature's supernatural nature and enormous size. The beast lay coiled around the base of the great oak like a living wall of obsidian scales, its massive head resting on loops of its own body, while its golden eyes remained fixed on the approaches to the sacred tree. The rhythmic rise and fall of its breathing created air currents that stirred the leaves overhead, while the heat radiating from its supernatural metabolism made the grove's temperature noticeably warmer than the surrounding forest. The dragon's awareness of their presence became apparent the moment they crossed the stone circle's threshold, its great head rising from its resting position to focus those burning eyes directly on the two intruders. The creature's intelligence was immediately evident in the way it assessed the threat they represented, its gaze shifting between Jason's weapons and Medea's magical implements as it calculated the appropriate response to their unauthorized presence. The low rumble that emerged from its throat was not quite a growl, but rather a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, causing small stones to dance and leaves to flutter despite the absence of any wind. Medea's application of her sleeping draught required her to approach within 20 feet of the dragon's head, a distance that brought her well within range of the creature's fiery breath and massive jaws. The young sorceress moved with deliberate slowness, her hands visible and empty except for the small vial containing her magical preparation. Her voice began the incantation that would activate the potion's supernatural properties, the ancient words carrying across the grove with a musical quality that seemed to harmonize with the eternal flames burning around the perimeter. The dragon's initial resistance to the sleeping magic manifested as increased agitation, its massive coils shifting restlessly while its tail lashed against the oak's trunk with impacts that shook the entire tree. The creature's supernatural nature provided significant protection against magical attacks, requiring Medea to pour more power into her incantation than she had ever attempted in previous workings. The strain of maintaining such intense magical focus began to show in her trembling hands and the perspiration that beaded on her forehead, despite the cool night air. The herbs that Medea scattered around the grove's perimeter were selected for their ability to enhance the sleeping draught's effectiveness, while creating a barrier that would prevent the dragon from awakening prematurely. Each plant had been gathered during specific lunar phases when their narcotic properties reached maximum potency, while their arrangement followed patterns that channeled supernatural forces according to principles that few mortals understood. The combination of the magical potion and the herbal barrier created a web of sleep-inducing power that gradually overcame even the dragon's divine resistance. The transformation in the dragon's behavior was gradual but unmistakable, its restless movements becoming slower and less coordinated as the sleeping magic took hold of its consciousness. The creature's great head began to sway hypnotically, its burning eyes losing focus as supernatural slumber overcame its vigilant nature. The rumbling sounds that had emerged from its throat grew softer and more rhythmic, eventually settling into the deep breathing pattern that indicated complete unconsciousness. The entire process required nearly an hour to reach completion, during which Jason remained motionless in the shadows while Medea maintained her magical concentration despite the enormous strain involved. The theft of the Golden Fleece itself proved anticlimactic after the drama of subduing its supernatural guardian, though the practical challenges of removing the treasure from its elevated position required careful planning and execution. The bronze hooks that secured the fleece to the oak's central branch were positioned nearly 60 feet above the ground, necessitating a climbing technique that Jason had learned during his training on Mount Pelion. The grappling hooks and rope that he had brought proved essential for reaching the treasure's location, while the fleece's supernatural weight made its removal more difficult than its appearance suggested. The moment when Jason's hands first touched the golden fleece was marked by a surge of divine power that seemed to flow through his entire body, confirming the treasure's supernatural nature while providing a glimpse of the cosmic forces that had created it. Each strand of the fleece felt warm to the touch despite the cool night air, while the material itself seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm like a living heartbeat. The fleece's weight was substantial but not overwhelming, though its dimensions made it awkward to manage while descending from the tree's elevated position. The dragon's continued slumber during the actual theft demonstrated the effectiveness of Medea's magical preparation, though both she and Jason remained acutely aware that the creature's supernatural nature made the duration of its unconsciousness impossible to predict with certainty. The young sorceress maintained her position near the beast's head throughout Jason's climb, ready to reinforce her sleeping spell if any signs of awakening became apparent. The dragon's breathing remained deep and regular, while its massive form showed no response to the sounds of Jason's movements in the branches overhead. Their departure from the sacred grove required the same careful attention to magical protocols that had governed their approach, as premature movement could trigger defensive spells that would alert every guard in the palace to their location. Medea's knowledge of the protective enchantments allowed them to retrace their steps through the stone circle without activating the warning systems that would normally respond to anyone carrying stolen treasures. The golden fleece itself seemed to cooperate with their escape, its supernatural radiance dimming to levels that would not betray their presence to distant observers. The return journey to the harbour proceeded through forest paths that Medea had scouted during previous nocturnal expeditions, their route avoiding areas where palace guards maintained regular patrols while providing the most direct access to the Argo's mooring. The young sorceress's intimate knowledge of Colchis's geography proved invaluable for navigating terrain that would have been treacherous for foreign visitors even in daylight. The golden fleece's weight made rapid movement impossible, requiring them to balance speed against the need for stealth as they made their way toward the waiting ship. The Argo's crew had been prepared for immediate departure since the previous evening, with all necessary supplies loaded and the vessel's rigging checked for the rapid exit that would be required once Jason returned with either the golden fleece or news of failure. The ship's prophetic figurehead had remained silent throughout the night, though its wooden features seemed more animated than usual, as if the sacred timber from Dodona was responding to the supernatural forces being unleashed in the nearby grove. The crew members who maintained watch duty reported unusual sounds from the direction of the royal forest, though none could identify their specific source or meaning. Aeetes' discovery of the golden fleece's theft came with the dawn, when the palace guards who maintained a distant observation of the sacred grove reported that the eternal flames around its perimeter had begun burning with unusual intensity. The king's immediate investigation revealed the dragon still lost in supernatural slumber, while the great oak's central branch hung empty of its precious burden. The evidence of magical intervention was unmistakable, from the scattered herbs around the grove's perimeter to the lingering traces of sorcerous energy that any trained practitioner could detect. The king's rage at this ultimate betrayal was compounded by his immediate understanding of who must have provided the magical assistance necessary to overcome his supernatural defences. Medea's absence from her chambers confirmed his suspicions, while her obvious flight with the foreign thieves transformed paternal disappointment into murderous fury. The young woman's betrayal represented not only the loss of his most precious treasure, but also the destruction of his plans for eliminating the threat that Jason's presence had represented to his continued rule. The pursuit that Aeetes organized proceeded with the efficiency of a military operation that had been planned in advance, though the king's preparations had been intended to prevent the Argonauts' escape rather than to recapture them after a successful theft. The Colchian fleet that put to sea included 12 warships, equipped with bronze-reinforced rams, and crews trained in the aggressive tactics that had made Aeetes' naval forces feared throughout the Black Sea region. Each vessel carried complement of marines armed with the supernatural weapons that Colchian metallurgy produced, while their commanders had been selected for their experience in pursuing and capturing foreign raiders. The Argo's head start proved crucial during the initial stages of the pursuit, as the distance gained during the night hours provided time for the crew to clear Colchian territorial waters before the enemy fleet could organise an effective response. However, the pursuing vessels were specifically designed for speed and manoeuvrability in the Black Sea's challenging conditions, while their crews possessed intimate knowledge of local currents and weather patterns that foreign sailors could not match. The gap between pursuer and pursued began to narrow as the morning progressed, making it clear that escape would require more than superior seamanship. Medea's decision to murder her brother Absyrtus represented the most horrific solution to their desperate situation, though her magical training had taught her to evaluate options based on practical effectiveness rather than moral considerations. The young prince had accompanied the pursuit fleet as both a symbol of royal authority and a potential hostage, whose presence might convince his sister to surrender voluntarily. His ship sailed closer to the Argo than the other pursuing vessels, bringing him within range of the magical trap that Medea prepared using techniques that her aunt Circe had taught her for dealing with enemies who possessed divine protection. The method of Absyrtus's death involved magical compulsions that drew him away from his protective escort, while clouding his judgment about the dangers he was facing. Medea's sorcery created illusions that made the young prince believe his sister was signalling her willingness to negotiate, leading him to approach the Argo in a small boat with minimal protection. The actual killing was accomplished through supernatural means that left no obvious evidence of foul play, though the prince's death served Medea's strategic purpose by creating chaos among the pursuing fleet as commanders struggled to understand what had occurred. The dismemberment of Absyrtus's body represented the most calculated aspect of Medea's plan, as the scattered remains would force Aeetes to delay his pursuit while gathering the pieces necessary for proper funeral rites. The king's paternal love for his son would compel him to ensure that the young man received appropriate burial honours, while religious law demanded that the body be complete before the necessary ceremonies could be performed. This delay would provide the Argo with the additional time needed to reach waters where the Colchian fleet's pursuit would become politically inadvisable. The psychological impact of witnessing Medea's cold-blooded murder of her own brother created lasting trauma among the Argonauts, many of whom had never encountered such calculated brutality despite their extensive experience with warfare and violence. The young woman's transformation from helpful ally to ruthless killer demonstrated capabilities that made her both invaluable and terrifying as a companion for their continued journey. The crew's relationship with their newest member would never recover from the horror of that morning, though their need for her magical abilities made open confrontation impossible. The Argo's escape from Colchian waters proceeded without further immediate pursuit, though the knowledge that Aeetes would eventually resume his efforts to recapture both his daughter and his stolen treasure cast a shadow over their success that would influence every subsequent decision about their route home. The Golden Fleece lay safely aboard their vessel, its supernatural radiance dimmed but not extinguished by its removal from the sacred grove, while Medea's presence provided both magical protection and a constant reminder of the prices that heroic achievement sometimes demanded. The divine retribution for Absyrtus's murder manifested almost immediately after the Argo cleared Colchian waters, as Zeus himself decreed that the Argonauts must seek purification for the blood guilt that now stained their expedition. The sacred timber from Dodona that formed the ship's prophetic prow spoke with unprecedented clarity, its wooden lips moving as if alive while delivering the god's judgment in words that carried the weight of cosmic law. The crew would not be permitted to return directly to Greece through their original route across the Black Sea and through the Hellespont, but must instead undertake a circuitous journey through unknown waters where they would face trials designed to test their worthiness for eventual redemption. The alternative route that Divine will impose upon them led westward from the Black Sea through waterways that existed at the very edges of the known world, where geography blended with myth and mortal sailors ventured at their peril. The Argo would need to navigate the Ister River, known to the Romans as the Danube, following its course upstream through barbarian territories where Greek names carried no authority and foreign customs governed every interaction. From there, their path would take them across an overland portage to the rivers that flowed toward the Western Ocean, eventually reaching the Mediterranean through waters that no previous expedition had successfully traversed. The journey up the Ister proved more challenging than even the most pessimistic crew members had anticipated, as the river's current worked constantly against their progress, while its banks teemed with hostile tribes who viewed any foreign vessel as a potential source of plunder. The Scythian and Thracian warriors who controlled these territories possessed neither the diplomatic sophistication that might have made negotiation possible, nor the healthy fear of Greek military prowess that had smoothed their passage through more civilized regions. These barbarians attacked with the desperate ferocity of men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from successful raids against obviously wealthy foreigners. The fighting that characterized this phase of their journey was unlike the heroic combats that had marked their earlier adventures, lacking the supernatural elements that had made previous challenges seem worthy of legendary status. Instead, the Argonauts found themselves engaged in brutal skirmishes against overwhelming numbers of enemies whose primitive weapons and tactics were compensated by intimate knowledge of local terrain and absolute willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of victory. The crew's superior training and equipment provided advantages that proved decisive in individual encounters, but the constant threat of attack made rest impossible while steadily depleting their strength and supplies. Medea's magical abilities proved essential during this phase of their journey, though her interventions carried a psychological cost that further alienated her from crew members who had never fully recovered from witnessing her brother's murder. The sorceress employed weather magic to create fog that concealed their movements during particularly dangerous passages, while her knowledge of protective enchantments warded off supernatural threats that inhabited the river's more remote reaches. Her healing arts treated wounds that conventional medicine could not address, though her patients often seemed more disturbed by her touch than grateful for her assistance. The overland portage that connected the Ister to the western flowing rivers required the Argonauts to disassemble their beloved vessel and transport it piece by piece across nearly 50 miles of mountainous terrain inhabited by tribes whose hostility made the river people seem welcoming by comparison. The sacred timber from Dodona proved surprisingly cooperative during this process, its supernatural properties allowing sections of the ship to be moved with less effort than their size and weight would normally have required. However, the work was still back-breaking, requiring weeks of labour during which the crew remained vulnerable to attack while making minimal progress toward their ultimate destination, the reassembly of the Argo in waters that eventually led to the Adriatic Sea marked a psychological turning point for the expedition, as the familiar routine of shipboard life provided some relief from the constant vigilance that overland travel had demanded. However, the crew's morale had been severely damaged by the hardships they had endured, while their supplies had been depleted to levels that made careful rationing essential for survival. The Golden Fleece remained safely stored in the ship's hold, its supernatural radiance providing the only reminder that their suffering served some greater purpose than mere survival. The Mediterranean waters that welcomed the Argo, after months of struggle through barbarian territories, seemed almost impossibly civilized, though the crew's relief was tempered by awareness that their trials were far from over. The prophetic figurehead had warned of specific challenges that awaited them during their homeward journey, supernatural encounters that would test not only their courage, but their ability to resist temptations that had destroyed previous expeditions. The first of these trials would come in the form of the sirens, whose deadly songs had lured countless ships to destruction on the rocky shores of their island domain. The sirens inhabited a small island off the coast of southern Italy, its cliffs rising directly from deep water that provided no safe anchorage for vessels seeking to avoid the creature's supernatural influence. These beings possessed the bodies of birds but the heads and voices of beautiful women, their appearance combining avian grace with human allure in ways that created an uncanny effect on mortal observers. Their wings, covered in feathers that shimmered with iridescent colours, allowed them to soar above approaching ships, while their voices carried across water with clarity that defied natural acoustics. The supernatural power of the siren's song lay not in its volume, but in its ability to speak directly to each listener's deepest desires and unfulfilled dreams, creating personalised visions of happiness that seemed achievable only by following the voices to their source. Sailors who heard these melodies found themselves experiencing memories of lost loves, abandoned ambitions, and roads not taken with such vivid intensity that reality itself seemed pale and unsatisfying by comparison. The compulsion to seek the source of such perfect understanding became irresistible, leading victims to leap overboard or steer their vessels directly onto the jagged rocks that surrounded the siren's perch. Orpheus's presence among the Argonauts provided their salvation from this supernatural threat, as the son of Apollo possessed musical abilities that could match or exceed even the siren's divine gifts. The bard's strategy involved not blocking the creature's song, but overwhelming it with music of such beauty and power that it would capture the crew's attention more completely than the enemy's supernatural melodies. His lyre, crafted from materials that existed only in the divine realm, produced harmonies that seemed to contain the essence of every emotion that mortals could experience, while his voice carried the authority of his divine parentage. The musical duel that ensued as the Argo approached the Siren's island created a supernatural cacophony that could be heard for miles across the surrounding waters, as two types of divine music competed for dominance over the minds and souls of the listening crew. Orpheus's performance drew upon every technique he had learned during his training under the Muses, while his emotional investment in protecting his companions added power that purely technical skill could never have provided. The strain of maintaining such intense musical focus for the hours required to pass beyond the siren's influence left the bard exhausted and hoarse, though his victory was complete. The passage through the straits between Scylla and Charybdis presented challenges that were more physical than supernatural, though no less deadly for their natural origins. Scylla, the six-headed monster that dwelt in a cave on one side of the narrow waterway, possessed the ability to snatch sailors from passing vessels with lightning-fast strikes that gave victims no opportunity for defense or escape. Each of her heads moved independently, allowing her to attack multiple targets simultaneously, while her serpentine necks provided reach that extended far beyond what her cave-bound position might suggest. Charybdis, the massive whirlpool that dominated the opposite side of the strait, operated according to a tidal cycle that made its periods of greatest danger predictable for navigators who possessed accurate timing information. During its active phases, the whirlpool could drag down vessels as large as warships, its rotating current creating suction that overcame even the strongest rowing efforts. However, the intervals between these destructive episodes provided windows of relative calm when skilled seamanship could carry a vessel through the strait with minimal risk. The Argo's passage through this legendary hazard required split-second timing and flawless coordination between helmsman and crew, as any deviation from their planned course could prove instantly fatal. Ancaeus of Tegea took the steering oar for this critical manoeuvre, his decades of maritime experience providing the expertise necessary to read the subtle signs that indicated Charybdis's current state of activity. The crew's rowing had to maintain precise rhythm and direction, despite the psychological pressure created by Scylla's looming presence, while their discipline prevented the panic that had doomed less experienced expeditions. The loss of 2 crew members to Scylla's attack demonstrated that even perfect planning could not eliminate all risks when facing supernatural opponents, as the monster's speed exceeded human ability to react defensively. The deaths occurred so quickly that the victims had no time to cry out, their absence only becoming apparent when their empty rowing positions disrupted the crew's carefully maintained rhythm. The psychological impact of these losses was severe, as the surviving Argonauts were forced to confront their own mortality while continuing to function as an effective unit under extreme stress. The encounter with Talos, the bronze giant who guarded the island of Crete, provided the expedition's final supernatural challenge before reaching Greek waters, though the nature of this opponent differed significantly from their previous adversaries. Talos stood nearly 100 feet tall, his body constructed entirely from bronze that had been alloyed with divine metals to create strength that exceeded any mortal craftsmanship. The giant's single vulnerable point was a bronze nail in his ankle that sealed the ichor-filled vein through which his artificial life flowed, though reaching this weakness required overcoming his massive size and supernatural vigilance. The giant's method of defending Crete involved hurling boulders with accuracy that made approach by sea extremely dangerous, while his ability to heat his bronze body to molten temperatures created additional hazards for anyone who managed to reach the island's shores. Ships that came too close to his position would find themselves targeted by projectiles weighing several tons, launched with force that could shatter any vessel's hull on impact. The heated bronze of his body could ignite wooden structures through mere contact, while his breath carried temperatures that would incinerate any mortal caught in its path. Medea's solution to this seemingly impossible challenge involved using her magical abilities to create psychological, rather than physical attacks, as the giant's bronze construction made him immune to conventional weapons, while his divine nature resisted most forms of supernatural assault. The sorceress employed illusion magic to create false images of attacking fleets that drew Talos' attention away from the actual Argo, while simultaneously working to weaken the bronze nail that maintained his artificial life. Her approach required hours of careful spellcasting during which the crew had to remain hidden while maintaining readiness for immediate departure. The giant's destruction came through the catastrophic failure of his single point of vulnerability, as Medea's magic finally succeeded in loosening the bronze nail that had contained his divine ichor for centuries. The golden fluid that poured from his ankle created a stream that could be seen for miles, while Talos' massive form began to show signs of the weakness that would ultimately prove fatal. His movements became increasingly unsteady as his artificial life drained away, until finally the bronze giant collapsed into the sea with an impact that created waves visible from the horizon. The Argo's arrival at Iolcus after more than 2 years of absence was marked by a mixture of triumph and profound disillusionment that reflected the psychological costs of their extended ordeal. The crew that returned bore little resemblance to the enthusiastic heroes who had departed with such high hopes, their faces marked by experiences that had tested not only their courage, but their fundamental understanding of justice and honour. The golden fleece that they carried represented undeniable proof of their success, yet its acquisition had required compromises that would haunt many of them for the remainder of their lives. King Pelias's reaction to his nephew's return was carefully controlled, as the usurper had spent the intervening years consolidating his power, while hoping that the expedition would never return to challenge his authority. The king's public celebration of Jason's achievement was elaborate and seemingly genuine, though his private consultations with trusted advisors focused on methods for eliminating the threat that the hero's success represented to his continued rule. The Golden Fleece's obvious supernatural properties made denying Jason's accomplishment impossible, while the expedition's fame had spread throughout the Greek world during their absence. Medea's solution to the political deadlock involved offering to use her magical abilities to restore Pelias's youth, a proposal that appealed to the aging king's vanity while providing an opportunity for the revenge that the sorceress had been planning since their departure from Colchis. The demonstration she provided involved rejuvenating an elderly ram through a process that appeared to involve dismemberment, followed by magical resurrection, though the actual mechanism was far more complex than the simple procedure she described to the king's daughters. The young women's eagerness to provide their father with renewed vitality made them eager participants in what they believed would be a beneficial magical working. The murder of Pelias was accomplished through the manipulation of his own daughters, who performed the dismemberment that Medea had demonstrated while believing they were conducting a rejuvenation ritual that would restore their father's youth and strength. The sorceress's magical preparations ensured that the king would die during the process, though she had convinced his daughters that their father's apparent death was merely a temporary state that would be reversed when the resurrection phase of the ritual was completed. The psychological trauma that the young women experienced when they realized they had been tricked into murdering their own father was precisely the kind of cruel revenge that Medea's nature demanded. However, the political consequences of Pelias's death did not unfold as Jason had hoped. As the king's supporters refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of a succession that had been achieved through obvious sorcery and foreign manipulation, the throne of Iolcus passed to Acastus, Pelias's son, whose first act as king was to exile both Jason and Medea from the kingdom they had sought to claim through their heroic achievements. The Golden Fleece, despite its supernatural properties and the tremendous costs incurred in its acquisition, proved worthless as a political tool when its bearers were seen as murderers and foreign agents rather than legitimate rulers. The years that followed Jason's exile were marked by a gradual deterioration in his relationship with Medea, as the psychological stresses of their shared experiences created tensions that no amount of mutual dependence could resolve permanently. The sorceress's increasingly erratic behaviour reflected both the isolation she experienced in Greek society and the supernatural forces that continued to influence her actions long after their departure from Colchis. Her magical abilities, which had proven so valuable during their adventures, became a source of fear and suspicion among the ordinary people who encountered them during their wanderings. Jason's eventual abandonment of Medea in favour of marriage to Glaus, daughter of King Creon of Corinth, represented both a calculated political decision and a desperate attempt to escape the psychological burden of his association with the sorceress's crimes. The hero's middle age had brought a pragmatic understanding that his legendary achievements would never translate into the political authority he had once expected, making a conventional marriage alliance seem like his best hope for establishing a stable future. His rejection of Medea was presented in terms of political necessity rather than personal preference, though the cruelty of his timing and methods revealed the moral compromises that his experiences had forced upon him. Medea's revenge against her faithless husband was swift, terrible, and comprehensive, targeting not only Jason himself but everyone he'd come to value in his new life. The sorceress used her magical abilities to create a poisoned robe and crown that killed both Glauce and King Creon when they came into contact with the supernatural toxins she had woven into the fabric. The deaths were agonizing and public, occurring during the wedding ceremony that was supposed to mark Jason's return to respectability and political relevance. The murder of her own children by Jason represented the culmination of Medea's descent into absolute evil, as she chose to destroy the innocent lives that had resulted from their union, rather than allow them to provide her former husband with any source of comfort or continuity. The boys died by their mother's own hand, their blood serving as the final payment for the supernatural transportation that would carry her beyond the reach of mortal justice. Her escape in a chariot drawn by dragons, provided by her grandfather Helios, marked the end of her direct involvement in Jason's story, though the curse she pronounced upon him would follow him for the remainder of his days. Jason's final years were spent in poverty and obscurity, his legendary achievements forgotten by a world that had moved on to celebrate newer heroes and different kinds of glory. The Golden Fleece, once the symbol of divine favour and heroic accomplishment, had long since lost its supernatural radiance and become merely an expensive curiosity that provided no practical benefit to its owner. The hero's attempts to trade on his past fame met with increasing indifference from younger generations who had never heard the songs that once celebrated his deeds throughout the Greek world. The manner of Jason's death was both fitting and pathetic, as the great hero met his end not in glorious battle or peaceful old age, but through a mundane accident that occurred while he slept beneath the rotting hull of the Argo. The ship that had carried him to fame and glory had been beached years earlier, its sacred timber from Dodona silent, and its prophetic powers exhausted by the weight of the curses that had accumulated around its former crew. A section of the deteriorating prow finally broke free during a storm, crushing the sleeping hero whose reflexes had been dulled by age and despair. The irony of Jason's fate was not lost on those few who remembered his story, as the vessel that had been the instrument of his greatest triumph became the means of his ignoble death. The Argo's destruction was complete within months of claiming its former captain's life, its supernatural construction finally succumbing to the natural forces that had been held at bay for decades by divine protection that was no longer effective. The Golden Fleece itself disappeared from history, its ultimate fate unknown, though some claimed it had been reclaimed by the gods who had originally blessed its creation. The legacy of the Argonauts' expedition lived on in the songs and stories that preserved their adventures for future generations, though the darker aspects of their journey were often omitted from popular retellings that preferred heroic inspiration to uncomfortable truths about the costs of legendary achievement. The crew members who survived their ordeal scattered across the Greek world, some achieving further fame in other adventures while others retreated into obscurity, haunted by memories of the choices they had made and witnessed during their quest for the Golden Fleece. Their story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing glory at any cost, while simultaneously celebrating the courage and determination that had made their impossible journey successful despite its ultimately hollow victory.